A 10-year-old boy with a high fever carried his sleeping 4-year-old sister from their locked basement during a power outage, when neighbors found them collapsed on their porch and called 911. The boys' delirious confession about their stepmother's punishment left police officers in tears. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-etched kitchen window of the Wheeler house, casting pale rectangles across the worn linoleum floor. 10-year-old Finley Wheeler stood on his tiptoes, carefully maneuvering the spatula beneath the edge of a pancake that sizzled in the cast-iron pan. His movements were practiced, almost mechanical, the unconscious precision of a child who had been cooking breakfast far longer than any child should need to. "Is it going to have a face?" Phoebe's small voice piped up from behind him. She sat at the kitchen table, her legs swinging freely, tiny feet not quite reaching the floor. At 4 years old, Phoebe Wheeler was all enormous blue eyes and unruly blonde curls, clutching a well-loved stuffed rabbit missing one button eye. "Of course it's going to have a face," Finley replied, not turning around. "Captain Pancake always has a face. How else would he see where he's flying?" This earned a delighted giggle from his sister, the sound momentarily lightening the permanent weight that had settled across Finley's narrow shoulders. He flipped the pancake with a practiced flick of his wrist, revealing a perfectly golden underside. The kitchen smelled of butter and warmth, a small pocket of comfort in a house that had grown increasingly cold in ways that had nothing to do with the bitter Massachusetts winter raging outside. "Blueberries for eyes?" Phoebe asked hopefully, stretching to see over the table edge. "2 blueberries for eyes," Finley confirmed, reaching for the small bowl of berries he'd set aside. "And maybe a strawberry smile? And whipped cream hair." "Now you're just being silly," he said, but smiled anyway, the expression transforming his solemn face into something that matched his age. These moments, making Phoebe laugh, seeing her happy, were increasingly rare treasures he hoarded against darker times. Finley Wheeler had a face that seemed perpetually caught between childhood and something far older. His features were delicate, almost too fine, but his hazel eyes held a vigilant watchfulness that belonged to someone who had learned the hard way that the world wasn't safe. Dark hair fell across his forehead in a perpetual tangle that he rarely bothered to smooth, except for school pictures or Sunday church. As he arranged the fruit into a cartoonish face on the pancake, Finley's mind catalogued the morning's tasks with the efficiency of a much older person. Get Phoebe fed. Make sure she wore her heavy sweater under her coat. Pack her lunch with the apple slices cut the way she liked them. Check if she needed a bathroom break before they walked to the bus stop. Drop her at kindergarten before heading to his own 5th grade classroom. All this before most children his age had even poured their own cereal. "Here comes Captain Pancake, flying in for a landing," Finley announced, sliding the pancake onto Phoebe's waiting plate with a flourish. He accompanied the motion with airplane noises that made Phoebe clap her hands in delight. "More syrup," she demanded, pointing imperiously at the bottle. "What's the magic word?" Finley prompted, holding the syrup just out of reach. "Please," Phoebe amended, drawing out the word with exaggerated politeness that made Finley smile again. He poured a modest amount of maple syrup, creating a small moat around Captain Pancake. "Not too much or you'll drown him," he cautioned, setting the bottle aside. "And we need to save some for tomorrow." The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made Finley's shoulders tense involuntarily. He quickly turned back to the stove, pouring more batter into the pan. The cheerful atmosphere in the kitchen shifted, a subtle change in pressure that even Phoebe seemed to feel, as her swinging legs stilled beneath the table. "Morning," Silas Wheeler mumbled as he entered the kitchen, already dressed in his work uniform. Heavy canvas pants and a thick flannel shirt with the Millbrook Paper Mill logo stitched above the pocket. He moved directly to the coffee maker, pouring himself a mug of the coffee Finley had brewed 20 minutes earlier. Silas Wheeler had once been a handsome man with an easy laugh, or so Finley remembered from before everything had splintered apart like ice on the mill pond in spring thaw. Now he seemed hollowed out, his once broad frame diminished somehow, as if grief had physically carved away at him. The lines around his eyes and mouth had deepened, and his dark hair, the same color as Finley's, was now threaded with gray at the temples. "Daddy, look at my Captain Pancake," Phoebe chirped, her voice bright with the undiminished hope that this time, her father might fully see her. Silas glanced at his daughter's plate and managed a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Looks good, Pumpkin." He ruffled her curls absently, then turned to Finley. "You making enough for everyone?" There was no real criticism in his father's tone, but Finley felt a familiar twist of anxiety nonetheless. "Yes, sir. Yours is next." His father grunted acknowledgement and leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee and staring at nothing in particular. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the soft sound of Phoebe's fork against her plate and the hiss of batter on the hot pan. "Where's Camille?" Finley finally asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Still sleeping," Silas replied. "Late night on the phone with her sister." Finley nodded, relieved. Mornings were easier when his stepmother slept in. The thought made guilt twine through his stomach. He should try harder, he knew, for his father's sake, for Phoebe. But something about Camille Wheeler had set off warning bells from the first moment his father had introduced her, barely 4 months after they'd buried his mother. Lorelei Wheeler had been everything warm and bright in their world. Her absence left a ragged hole that Finley still fell into sometimes, moments when the missing of her was so acute it felt like physically falling. She had been gone for 14 months now. Cancer that had started in her breast and spread with a veracity that had shocked even the doctors. And 6 months after they'd lowered her into the frozen ground, Silas had brought home Camille. Finley flipped the second pancake and tried to push away the memory of that night. His father's nervous, forced enthusiasm. Camille's perfectly arranged smile that never quite reached her eyes. The way she'd hugged Phoebe just a little too tightly, making his sister squirm uncomfortably. "She's going to help us," his father had explained later, as if their broken little family were a problem that needed solving rather than people who needed time to heal. "I've got something to tell you both," Silas said suddenly, setting his coffee mug down with a decisive click. Finley turned from the stove, spatula in hand, a cold sense of apprehension spreading through his chest. "I have to go to Boston for a training course. The mill is upgrading some of the machinery, and they're sending a few of us to learn the new systems." Silas ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that reminded Finley painfully of before his mother got sick, when his father still laughed and played catch in the backyard. "How long?" Finley asked, already calculating adjustments to their precarious routine. "A week, Sunday to Friday. It's mandatory or I wouldn't go." Silas wasn't quite meeting his son's eyes. "Camille will take care of things here." The pancake began to smoke slightly, and Finley quickly turned back to the stove, flipping it to reveal a too dark underside. His mind raced through implications, contingencies, potential problems. "But who will read me stories?" Phoebe asked, lower lip beginning to tremble. Their father had maintained exactly one parental duty since their mother's death, reading Phoebe her bedtime story, though even this had become increasingly perfunctory. "Camille can read to you, sweetheart," Silas said, crouching beside her chair. "Or maybe Finley." "I always read to her anyway," Finley said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. If his father heard the comment, he chose to ignore it. "I'll bring you both something from Boston," he continued, forcing brightness into his voice. "What would you like?" "A doll that looks like Mommy," Phoebe said immediately. The kitchen went silent. Finley froze with the spatula midair. Their father's face did something complicated. A spasm of pain quickly masked. "Phoebe," Silas began, then stopped. He swallowed visibly. I think what Phoebe means," Finley interjected quickly, "is that she'd like a doll with yellow hair, like Mommy had." He shot his sister a warning look that she couldn't possibly understand. "Yellow hair," Phoebe agreed, oblivious to the tension. "And a blue dress." Silas nodded, seemingly grateful for the interpretation. "I can do that." He straightened and turned to Finley. "And you?" Finley slid the slightly burnt pancake onto a plate for his father. "I don't need anything," he said. "Everyone needs something," his father insisted, taking the plate. "Come on, name it." What Finley needed couldn't be bought in Boston or anywhere else. He needed his mother back. He needed his father to really see what was happening in their house. He needed to not be so afraid all the time. Maybe a book? He suggested instead, knowing it was the expected response. Finley had always been the reader, lost in stories when reality became too much to bear. A book it is, Silas agreed, squeezing a generous amount of syrup over his pancake. You'll help Camille with Phoebe while I'm gone? Man of the house and all that. I always do, Finley said, turning back to the stove to make his own breakfast, the last of the batter barely enough for a small pancake. He wouldn't mention that he already did most of the caretaking for Phoebe, or that Camille rarely lifted a finger to help with either child unless Silas was watching. I know you do, son. Silas's voice softened momentarily, a glimpse of the father he'd once been. You're a good big brother. Your mom would be proud. The mention of his mother made Finley's throat tighten painfully. He nodded without turning around, not trusting himself to speak. The kitchen door swung open, and Camille Wheeler entered the room like a change in weather. She was objectively beautiful, tall and slim, with glossy dark hair cut in a fashionable bob and perfectly applied makeup even at this early hour. She wore silk pajamas under a matching robe, an outfit that seemed better suited to a magazine spread than a shabby kitchen in a declining mill town. Good morning, family, she said, her voice musical and controlled. Finley felt the familiar tension coil at the base of his spine. He kept his eyes fixed on the stove, monitoring his meager pancake. Darling? Silas straightened immediately, his entire demeanor shifting to anxious attentiveness. Did we wake you? Finley's made pancakes. How lovely, Camille said, though she made no move toward the stove or table. Instead, she glided to the coffee maker, pouring herself a cup. Though I hope there's no sugar in the batter. You know how I feel about starting the day with empty calories. Just a little, Finley murmured, not mentioning that the recipe was his mother's, one of the few tangible things he had left of her. Camille smiled thinly. Well, I'll stick to my grapefruit, I think. She turned to Silas, her expression warming slightly. Did you tell them about your trip? Just now, Silas confirmed, returning to his breakfast. They took it well. Of course we did, Finley thought bitterly. What choice do we have? I was thinking, Camille continued, perching delicately on one of the kitchen chairs, that we could have a special girls' weekend while Daddy's away. Would you like that, Phoebe? Phoebe, who had been watching Camille with the wary fascination of a small animal observing a potential predator, nodded uncertainly. We could do makeovers and watch princess movies, Camille continued, her voice taking on a syrupy quality that made Finley's teeth ache. Just us girls. What about Finley? Phoebe asked, glancing at her brother. Oh, Finley's not a girl, silly, Camille laughed, the sound like wind chimes. Pretty but hollow. He can do boy things. What boy things? Phoebe persisted, frowning. Guy stuff, Silas interjected, apparently sensing a need to participate. Maybe work on that model airplane I got you for Christmas? He suggested to Finley, who couldn't remember the last time his father had shown interest in anything he did. Sure, Finley agreed automatically, knowing the unopened model kit would remain untouched. His actual plans involved keeping Phoebe as close as possible and staying out of Camille's way. It's settled then, Camille said, standing gracefully. We'll manage just fine without you, darling, she added to Silas, leaning down to kiss his cheek. Finley watched his father lean into the affection like a plant seeking sunlight. It hurt to see. His father, once so strong and sure, now seemed desperate for any warmth Camille deigned to give him. I know you will, Silas said, capturing her hand and squeezing it. I'm lucky to have you. The expression that flickered across Camille's face when Silas looked away was so swift that Finley might have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. A tightening around the eyes, a downward twist of the lips, irritation, perhaps, or something colder. It vanished instantly, replaced by her usual controlled smile. We should get ready for school, Finley said to Phoebe, setting his own barely touched breakfast aside. The bus comes in 20 minutes. But you didn't eat your Captain Pancake, Phoebe protested. I'll eat it later, Finley lied, helping her down from her chair. Let's brush your teeth and find your mittens. As they left the kitchen, Finley heard Camille's voice drop to a murmur. Are you sure you have to go for the whole week? You know how I miss you when you're away. Her tone was different now, softer, almost vulnerable. A voice Finley had never heard directed at anyone except his father. He paused in the hallway, Phoebe's small hand clasped in his, listening despite himself. I wish I could get out of it, his father replied, his voice low and apologetic. But Collins said the training is mandatory. They're only sending 4 of us, and I need to keep this job, especially now. I know, darling. Camille's voice held a perfect blend of understanding and disappointment. It's just so long to be without you. Finley tugged Phoebe gently toward the bathroom, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. He didn't want to hear his father's gratitude, his eagerness to please this woman who had slipped into their lives like a fox into a henhouse. The upstairs bathroom was small and drafty, with cracked tiles and a perpetually dripping faucet that Silas had promised to fix for months. Finley helped Phoebe onto the little step stool in front of the sink and squeezed a ribbon of toothpaste onto her Winnie the Pooh toothbrush. You have to do little circles, he reminded her, demonstrating on his own teeth. Like this, see? Phoebe imitated him, toothpaste foam dribbling down her chin. Is Camille really going to do makeovers with me? She asked around her toothbrush. Finley hesitated. Maybe, he said carefully. But don't be sad if she's busy. Okay? We can do our own fun things. Phoebe spat into the sink. I don't really want to do makeovers, she confided. I want to play cave explorers in the blanket fort. Relief washed through Finley. Then that's what we'll do, he promised, wiping her chin with a washcloth. The biggest, best blanket fort ever. With the flashlights? Definitely with the flashlights. Phoebe beamed at him, her small face alight with trust and love, unaware of the knot of worry that had settled in Finley's stomach. A full week alone with Camille stretched before them like a dark tunnel. It wasn't that their stepmother had ever hurt them, not physically. It was more subtle than that. The way she'd forget to call them for dinner, or not notice when Phoebe needed help with something, or the cutting remarks she made when Silas wasn't around to hear. You look just like your mother in that light, she'd said to Finley once, her voice sharp with an emotion he couldn't identify. It's unsettling. He'd never told his father about any of it. What would he say? That his new wife sometimes looked at his children with something like hatred? That she seemed to resent every moment she had to spend in their company? It would sound like the jealous complaints of a child who couldn't accept a new mother. And besides, his father was happy. Or at least, less unhappy than he'd been in the awful months after Lorelei died, when Silas had moved through the house like a ghost, unable to even look at his children without breaking down. If Camille gave him some comfort, some reason to get up in the morning, how could Finley take that away? Finley! Phoebe tugged at his sleeve. Are you sleepy? He realized he'd been staring blankly at the chipped bathroom mirror. No bug, just thinking. Let's get your face washed and find those mittens. Okay? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, helping Phoebe into her clothes, packing their lunches, bundling them both into winter gear for the frigid walk to the bus stop. Silas left for work with distracted goodbyes and a reminder about his trip on Sunday. Camille disappeared back upstairs with her coffee and grapefruit, re-emerging only to wave them off from the front door, her smile firmly in place for any watching neighbors. The January air bit at Finley's exposed face as they trudged down the driveway, their breath forming small clouds in front of them. Phoebe's mitten-clad hand was warm in his, her chatter about kindergarten projects flowing around him without requiring much response. Millbrook was a town in slow decline, its fortunes tied to the paper mill that had been shedding jobs for years. Their street was lined with Victorian houses like their own, once grand but now showing signs of neglect. Peeling paint, sagging porches, gardens gone to seed. Still, there was a certain faded beauty to it all, especially under the clean blanket of snow that smoothed over the rough edges. Do you think it will snow more today? Phoebe asked, kicking at a small drift with her boot. Probably, Finley replied, eyeing the heavy gray sky. The weatherman said we might get another 3 inches. Enough for a snowman? Definitely enough for a snowman. As they approached the bus stop where a handful of other children already waited, Finley felt a twinge of something like envy. These kids with their ordinary problems and intact families. Did they know how lucky they were? The school bus lumbered into view, its yellow paint bright against the monochrome landscape. Finley adjusted Phoebe's scarf one last time. "Remember, I'll meet you right here after school," he reminded her. "Don't go with anyone else, even if they say I sent them." It was the same instruction he gave every day, perhaps unnecessarily, but the habits of vigilance were deeply ingrained now. "I know, Finley," Phoebe sighed with the exaggerated patience of a 4-year-old who thinks she's much older. "You tell me every day. Because it's important every day," he replied, bending to kiss her forehead. "Have a good day at school, Bug." "You too," she chirped, already turning toward the bus, eager to join the line of other kindergartners. Finley watched her climb the high steps, her pink backpack bouncing with each movement. A strange tightness gripped his chest, an irrational fear that seized him whenever they separated. He waited until she found a seat by the window and waved, her small face pressed against the glass, before he allowed himself to join the line for his own bus. The familiar weight of responsibility settled over him as he found an empty seat. He had 5 days to prepare for his father's absence. 5 days to figure out how to keep Phoebe safe and happy for an entire week under Camille's cold gaze. 5 days to stockpile snacks in their rooms in case Camille forgot meals again. 5 days to brace himself for whatever was coming. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Finley pressed his forehead against the cold window glass and tried to think of new stories to tell Phoebe. Tales of brave explorers and magic kingdoms where children were always safe and mothers never died and fathers saw everything clearly. Stories where the monsters were easily recognized and defeated, not wearing pretty smiles and designer clothes. Stories that were nothing like real life. The bus turned a corner, and the Wheeler house slipped from view, the curtain in the upstairs window falling back into place, as if someone had been watching them leave. Finley shivered, though the bus was overheated and stuffy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, some balance tipping, and that the week ahead would change everything. It was the same feeling he'd had the day the doctors had first used the word terminal about his mother. A presentiment of darkness so strong it felt like physical pressure against his skin. "Hey, Wheeler, you look like someone walked over your grave," said Dominic Garcia, sliding into the seat beside him. Dominic was one of the few kids at Millbrook Elementary who didn't treat Finley like he was contagious after his mother died. "Just tired," Finley replied, forcing a smile. "Did you finish the math homework?" And just like that, he was pulled back into the normal world of 5th grade concerns, fractions and spelling tests and playground politics. The weight in his chest didn't disappear, but it receded enough that he could breathe around it, could pretend to be a regular kid for a few hours. It was almost enough. 3 days into Silas's absence, the Wheeler house stood silent under a thickening blanket of snow. The storm that meteorologists had been tracking across the Midwest had finally reached Massachusetts, bringing with it temperatures that plunged well below freezing and snowfall that had already closed schools for 2 days. Finley sat cross-legged on the basement floor, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls, transforming the water stains into fantastical shapes, dragons and castles and distant mountain ranges. He'd been pointing these out to Phoebe for hours now, weaving stories about each one to distract her from their hunger and the steadily dropping temperature. "And that one there," he said, gesturing to a particularly elaborate stain that spread like a dark archipelago across the ceiling. "That's the lost islands of Xander, where the sky pirates hide their treasure." Phoebe followed his gaze, her blue eyes wide. She sat nestled against him, cocooned in both her own blanket and his winter coat. Her face was pale except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheeks, but at least she wasn't shivering anymore. "Are the pirates bad?" she asked, her voice small in the vast emptiness of the basement. Finley considered this, reaching for the right details to enhance the story. "Not all of them. Some are just people who wanted to be free, So they built flying ships and sailed away from the rules of the ground kingdoms. "I'd like a flying ship," Phoebe murmured drowsily, leaning more heavily against him. "Me too, Bug." Finley tightened his arm around her. "We could fly anywhere we wanted." His gaze drifted to the basement door at the top of the stairs, still firmly locked from the outside. They'd been down here since yesterday afternoon, 24 hours, give or take, with nothing but a bottle of water, a package of saltine crackers, and the small bathroom in the unfinished corner of the basement. The initial punishment had been for Phoebe's crime of accidentally spilling orange juice on Camille's laptop. But Finley suspected their continued imprisonment had more to do with Camille's desire for uninterrupted time with her visiting friend, Diane. The two women had spent the evening drinking wine and laughing loudly upstairs, the sounds echoing through the heating duct like the cackling of distant witches. Finley had covered Phoebe's ears during the worst of it, when Camille had drunkenly complained about being saddled with someone else's brats, and her friend had suggested various management techniques that made Finley's blood run cold. "Tell me more about the Sky Pirates," Phoebe prompted, pulling Finley back from his dark thoughts. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Well, they have a queen, the fiercest pirate of them all. She has hair like fire and a sword made from a star that fell to earth. Her name is—" He hesitated, searching for a suitably impressive name. "Lorelei," Phoebe said decisively. "Like Mommy." A lump formed in Finley's throat. "Like Mommy," he agreed softly. "Queen Lorelei of the Sky Pirates. And she protects all the children," Phoebe continued, her eyes drifting closed. "She brings them toys and cake and never locks them in dark places." Finley closed his eyes briefly against the sting of tears. "That's right. She'd never do that." The light bulb flickered suddenly, plunging them into momentary darkness before resurging. Finley tensed, eyes fixed on the unreliable illumination. The last thing they needed was to lose power in the middle of a snowstorm while locked in a basement. A wave of dizziness washed over him as he shifted position. He'd been feeling progressively worse since morning. Hot one minute, freezing the next, with an ache behind his eyes that made it hard to focus. But he couldn't afford to be sick. Not now. Not with Phoebe depending on him and Camille already looking for excuses to punish them further. "I'm thirsty," Phoebe whispered, rousing from her half-doze. Finley reached for the water bottle, which was nearly empty. He allowed her a small sip, then took one himself, rationing what remained. "We need to save some for later," he explained when she looked at him with pleading eyes. "When is later?" she asked. "When can we go upstairs?" "Soon," Finley lied. "Camille will let us up soon." In truth, he had no idea when their stepmother would remember they existed. Her friend's car was still in the driveway the last time Finley had peered through the small, ground-level window, its outline blurred by the accumulating snow. The women could be passed out from their night of drinking, or they might have decided to extend their girls' weekend indefinitely. At least Phoebe had stopped asking for food. The crackers had run out hours ago, and the gnawing emptiness in Finley's stomach had become a familiar companion over the past months. He had learned to ignore it, to push it down along with the other discomforts and indignities of their new life. But Phoebe was only 4. She shouldn't have to learn these lessons. A sudden slamming sound from upstairs made them both jump. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above them, accompanied by muffled voices. Finley strained to hear, but couldn't make out words, only tones. Camille's voice sharp with irritation, her friend's deeper tones soothing or placating. The footsteps approached the basement door. Finley straightened, nudging Phoebe. "Sit up, Bug," he whispered urgently. "Camille's coming." Phoebe blinked owlishly, struggling to shake off her drowsiness. Finley quickly smoothed her hair and pinched some color into her cheeks, the way he'd seen their mother do before taking family photos. The lock clicked, and the door at the top of the stairs swung open, spilling hallway light into the gloom of the basement. Camille stood silhouetted against the brightness, one hand on her hip. "Are you two still moping down there?" she called, as if they were hiding by choice. "I swear, the dramatics." Finley bit back the retort that sprang to his lips. Antagonizing Camille would only make things worse. We're okay, he said instead, his voice rasping slightly. Can we come up now, please? Camille descended a few steps, stopping halfway down. She was dressed for an outing, designer jeans, knee-high boots, a cashmere sweater in a shade of blue that matched her eyes perfectly. Her dark hair was freshly styled, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, not in a dingy basement in a decaying mill town. I suppose you've had enough time to think about respect for other people's property, she said, examining her manicured nails. Do you have something to say, Phoebe? Phoebe stared up at her stepmother, her bottom lip trembling slightly. I'm sorry I spilled juice on your computer, she whispered. Speak up, Camille snapped. I can't hear mumbling. I'm sorry I spilled juice on your computer, Phoebe repeated, louder this time, her small voice echoing in the basement. Camille nodded, seemingly satisfied. And you'll be more careful in the future? Yes, Mrs. Wheeler, Phoebe said, using the formal address that Camille had insisted upon shortly after moving in. Never Mom or even Camille, always Mrs. Wheeler, as if she were a stern Victorian governess instead of their stepmother. Good. Camille's gaze shifted to Finley, her eyes narrowing slightly. You don't look well. Finley suppressed a shiver, acutely aware of the fever that had been building steadily. I'm fine, he said quickly. Just hungry. Something like concern flickered across Camille's face, so briefly that Finley might have imagined it. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at the children. Diane and I are going out for a while. There's a storm coming, so we need to stock up on a few things. Can we come with you? Finley asked, already knowing the answer but hoping nonetheless. In this weather? Don't be silly. You'd just slow us down. Camille started back up the stairs. You can come up and fix yourselves something to eat. But stay out of the living room. Diane left her art supplies out and they're very expensive. And don't make a mess in the kitchen. Yes, Mrs. Wheeler. They chorused, the relief of freedom temporarily overshadowing everything else. Finley helped Phoebe to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. They climbed the stairs slowly, Finley's legs trembling with the effort of maintaining his balance through another wave of dizziness. The kitchen was warm and bright after the basement gloom, the overhead lights almost painfully intense to Finley's sensitive eyes. Diane, a tall woman with cropped silver hair and an intimidating number of earrings, stood by the counter rummaging through her purse. She glanced up as they entered, her heavily lined eyes widening slightly. Jesus, Cam, they look terrible, she said, her voice carrying a faint Boston accent. The little one's white as a sheet. They're just hungry, Camille replied dismissively, pulling on her coat. They get dramatic when they miss a meal. Diane's gaze lingered on Finley, taking in his flushed face and two bright eyes. That boy needs a doctor, not a sandwich, she muttered, but didn't press the issue. We'll be back in a couple of hours, Camille announced, retrieving her car keys from the hook by the door. Remember what I said. Stay out of the living room, don't make a mess, and don't answer the phone or door if anyone comes by. Yes, Mrs. Wheeler, Finley responded automatically, already moving toward the refrigerator. The thought of food had awakened a ravenous hunger that momentarily overshadowed his discomfort. As the door closed behind the women, Phoebe let out a small sigh of relief. I don't like her friend, she whispered, as if Diane might still hear her. She smells funny. Cigarettes, Finley explained, surveying the refrigerator's meager contents. There wasn't much. Some condiments, half a loaf of bread, a package of lunch meat that he eyed suspiciously before deciding it was probably still good. And maybe too much perfume. He set about making sandwiches while Phoebe climbed onto a chair at the table, her legs swinging idly. The simple task of spreading mayonnaise and arranging turkey slices required more concentration than it should have. His hands clumsy and uncooperative. By the time he placed a plate in front of Phoebe, his shirt was sticking to his back with sweat despite the chill in the air. Aren't you eating? Phoebe asked around a mouthful of sandwich. In a minute, Finley replied, leaning against the counter as another wave of dizziness washed over him. Drink your water first, bug. He filled a glass from the tap and placed it beside her plate, then did the same for himself, drinking deeply. The cool water was a momentary relief for his parched throat, but it sat uneasily in his stomach. Through the kitchen window, he could see the snow falling more heavily now, the flakes thick and numerous, obscuring the view of the backyard. The wind had picked up too, driving the snow sideways against the house with a soft hissing sound. "Will Daddy be able to come home in the snow?" Phoebe asked, following his gaze to the window. "He's not supposed to be back until Friday," Finley reminded her, finally taking a small bite of his own sandwich. The bread felt like sawdust in his mouth, and he had to force himself to chew and swallow. "But he'll make it, don't worry. 3 more days. They just had to get through 3 more days, and then their father would be home and things would go back to, well, not normal. Nothing had been normal since their mother died. But at least with Silas present, Camille kept her cruelty in check, limited to cold stares and cutting remarks rather than outright neglect or punishment. A strange lethargy was creeping through Finley's limbs, making even the simple act of standing an effort. He sank into a chair opposite Phoebe, pushing his barely touched sandwich aside. "How are you feeling, Bug?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Better now," she said, swinging her legs happily. "Can we watch cartoons?" Finley glanced at the clock on the microwave. They probably had at least an hour before Camille and Diane returned, maybe more if the storm made driving difficult. "Sure," he agreed, "but let's stay in the kitchen. We can use Dad's old portable TV." The ancient television set lived on top of the refrigerator, a relic from the days when Silas would watch baseball games while cooking Sunday dinners. It hadn't been used much since Lorelei died, and the family meals had dwindled to hastily assembled sandwiches or takeout eaten in separate rooms. Finley retrieved it with shaking hands, nearly dropping it as another spell of dizziness hit him. He set it on the table and plugged it in, fiddling with the rabbit ear antenna until a grainy picture appeared through the static. "It's the weatherman," Phoebe observed, peering at the screen where a grim-faced meteorologist stood before a map of New England covered in swirling patterns of blue and white. "Expect accumulations of 18 to 24 inches by morning," the meteorologist was saying. "Wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour will create near-blizzard conditions and dangerous wind chills. Power outages are likely as the snow brings down tree limbs and power lines." Finley frowned, a new worry taking shape. If the storm was that severe, would Camille and Diane even be able to make it back? And if they did, would they be stuck in the house together for days with no escape to school or even the backyard? The meteorologist continued his dire predictions, but his voice was drowned out by a sudden howl of wind that rattled the kitchen windows. Phoebe looked up anxiously. "That's just the wind, Bug," Finley assured her, though the sound had unsettled him too. "Nothing to be scared of." "Can we build our blanket fort now?" she asked hopefully. "You promised." Finley hesitated. He didn't feel well enough for fort building, but the activity would keep Phoebe distracted and happy, and they needed to take advantage of their freedom while it lasted. "Let's do it in our rooms," he suggested. "That way if Camille comes back, we won't be in her way." They spent the next hour dragging blankets and pillows between their small adjacent bedrooms, creating a tunnel of fabric that connected Phoebe's twin bed to Finley's. The exertion left Finley breathless and sweating, his hands trembling as he secured blanket corners with heavy books. But Phoebe's delight was worth it. Her giggles as she crawled through the makeshift passage, pretending to be an explorer discovering new lands. "This is Base Camp Phoebe," she announced, poking her head out from the blanket doorway. "Captain Finley, do you copy?" "I copy. Base Camp Phoebe," Finley replied, mustering enthusiasm despite the pounding in his head. "What's your status?" "I found treasure," she exclaimed, disappearing back into the fort. Finley slumped against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. He was burning up now, his skin hot to the touch, yet he couldn't stop shivering. He knew he should take some medicine, but the thought of searching for the thermometer and children's Tylenol in the bathroom cabinet required more energy than he could muster. Just a few minutes of rest, he told himself. Then he'd check on Phoebe and find some medicine. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, Phoebe was shaking his shoulder urgently. Finley, the lights are doing funny things. He blinked, disoriented. The room seemed darker than before. As he watched, the overhead light flickered, dimmed, then brightened again. It's okay, he said automatically, though a sense of foreboding settled in his stomach. Sometimes that happens in storms. As if in response, the entire house went dark with a soft electrical sigh. Phoebe gasped, her hand finding his in the sudden blackness. Don't be scared, Finley whispered, squeezing her fingers. It's just a power outage. Remember when we lost power last summer during the thunderstorm? It's the same thing, except it wasn't. Last summer had been warm, and they treated the power outage like an adventure, eating ice cream before it could melt and playing board games by candlelight with their father. Now it was the dead of winter, with temperatures well below freezing and a blizzard raging outside. And they were alone. I'll find the flashlights, Finley said, struggling to his feet. Stay right here, okay? No. Phoebe clung to his hand. Don't leave me in the dark. Okay, Finley soothed. Come with me then. The flashlights are in the kitchen drawer. They made their way carefully down the stairs, Finley keeping a firm grip on the railing as another wave of dizziness threatened his balance. The house was eerily silent without the background hum of appliances and heating system. The only sound the howling of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old structure straining against the storm. The kitchen was gray with early evening light filtered through snow-covered windows. Finley fumbled through the utility drawer until his fingers closed around two flashlights. He clicked one on, the beam cutting through the gloom and lending the familiar kitchen an unfamiliar, spectral quality. Here, he said, handing the second flashlight to Phoebe. Now we each have one. She took it solemnly, clicking it on and off with fascination. Like real explorers, she said. Exactly. Finley leaned against the counter, trying to think through the fog in his brain. We should probably get more blankets, he decided. It's going to get cold without the heat. They collected every spare blanket from the linen closet, along with Silas's winter coat and a pair of his wool socks that Finley insisted Phoebe wear over her own. Back in their blanket fort, they huddled together like hibernating animals, Phoebe eventually drifting off to sleep despite the unfamiliar circumstances, lulled by another of Finley's elaborate stories. But Finley couldn't sleep. His fever seemed to be worsening, bringing with it a strange, disjointed awareness where the boundaries between reality and imagination blurred. The shadows cast by their flashlights seemed to move independently, forming shapes that whispered just at the edge of hearing. At one point, he was certain he saw his mother sitting at the foot of Phoebe's bed, her golden hair illuminated by a light that had no source. She looked just as she had before the illness took hold, vibrant and beautiful, her eyes crinkled with the smile that had always made Finley feel safe. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. She didn't speak, but her expression was urgent, her hand extended toward him in a beckoning gesture. Finley tried to reach for her, but his limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. "I don't feel good," he told the apparition. "I think I'm really sick." His mother's expression shifted to concern, then determination. She pointed toward the door, then at Phoebe's sleeping form. "I don't understand," Finley murmured. "What do you want me to do?" But the vision was already fading, dissolving into the darkness like snow melting on skin. Finley blinked, and she was gone, leaving him unsure if she had ever been there at all. Hours passed in a delirium of half-dreams and waking confusion. The house grew progressively colder, their breath visible in the dim flashlight beam. Phoebe whimpered in her sleep but didn't wake, burrowing deeper into the nest of blankets. Outside, the storm raged unabated, the wind screaming around the corners of the old Victorian like a living thing seeking entry. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Finley heard a sound that penetrated even his fever-addled consciousness. The distinctive click of a key in the front door lock. Camille and Diane were back. Relief flooded through him, despite everything. Adults would know what to do about the power outage, about the cold, about his fever that wouldn't break. He listened for their voices, for the sound of stomping snow from boots and the rustle of grocery bags. But there was only silence, then the soft thud of the front door closing. A single set of footsteps moved through the downstairs rooms, too heavy for Camille or Diane. Finley tensed, suddenly alert despite his illness. An intruder? A burglar taking advantage of the power outage? Phoebe, he whispered, shaking his sister gently. Wake up, Bug. Be very quiet. She stirred, blinking at him in confusion. What's wrong? Shoo, he cautioned, pressing a finger to his lips. I think someone's in the house. Her eyes widened with fear, but she remained silent, trusting him implicitly as she always did. The footsteps were moving up the stairs now, slow and deliberate. Finley's heart pounded painfully against his ribs. He looked around frantically for a weapon, something to defend them with, but found nothing more threatening than a hardback copy of The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe. The footsteps reached the landing, then paused. A beam of light swept under the door, a flashlight moving methodically as if searching. Finley? Phoebe? Called a familiar voice. Are you kids here? Daddy! Phoebe squealed, scrambling out of the blanket fort before Finley could stop her. She threw open the bedroom door and launched herself at Silas Wheeler, who stood in the hallway looking travel-worn and worried, a dusting of snow still on his shoulders. Thank God, he breathed, scooping her up. When I couldn't reach anyone on the phone, I got worried. Where's your brother? Where's Camille? Finley's sick, Phoebe informed him solemnly. And Camille went out with her friend who smells funny. Silas frowned, stepping into the room as Finley emerged unsteadily from the blanket fort. One look at his son's flushed face and glassy eyes, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Jesus, Finn, you're burning up, he said, pressing a hand to Finley's forehead. How long have you been like this? Since yesterday, I think, Finley mumbled, swaying slightly. Now that his father was here, the adrenaline that had kept him functioning was ebbing, leaving him weaker than before. Maybe the day before. And Camille left you alone? In a blackout. Silas's voice held an edge Finley had never heard before. Where did she go? Shopping, Finley answered, his thoughts becoming increasingly disjointed. Storm coming. She took Diane. Who the hell is Diane? Silas demanded, but Finley's vision was tunneling, the edges going dark. Dad, he managed. I don't feel. And then he was falling, the room tilting sideways as consciousness slipped away. The last thing he heard was his father's panicked voice calling his name. When Finley next opened his eyes, he was lying in his bed, a cool cloth on his forehead and the beam of a flashlight propped on his nightstand creating a small pool of illumination. Silas sat beside him, his face lined with worry. Hey, buddy, his father said softly when he saw Finley was awake. How are you feeling? Cold, Finley whispered, though he was sweating beneath the blankets. Where's Phoebe? Right here, Silas assured him, gesturing to where Phoebe was curled in an armchair in the corner, wrapped in blankets and fast asleep. She wouldn't leave you. The power, still out. Whole town from what I could see driving in. But I've got the camp stove from the garage set up downstairs. We'll be okay. Silas hesitated, then asked carefully, Finn, where's Camille? When did she leave? Finley tried to organize his scattered thoughts. This afternoon, before the storm got bad. She locked us in the basement yesterday because Phoebe spilled juice, but she let us out before she left. Silas went very still. She what? Something in his father's tone cut through Finley's fever haze. He'd said too much. It wasn't that bad, he backpedaled weakly. Just for a little while. But Silas wasn't listening. He'd risen from the bed and was pacing the small room, his expression thunderous. She locked my children in the basement, as punishment, and then left you alone in a goddamn blizzard. Dad, has this happened before? Silas demanded, turning back to Finley. Tell me the truth, son. Finley hesitated, torn between his habitual protectiveness, of his father's feelings, of the fragile peace they'd established, and the relief of finally being asked directly. Sometimes, he admitted, when you're at work, Not all the time. Silas closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. What else, Finley? What else has she done? The dam broke. All the small cruelties, the neglect, the cold words and colder silences. They poured out of Finley in a disjointed stream, his fever lending the confession a dreamlike quality that made it easier somehow. He told his father everything, from Camille's forgetting, to feed them to her cutting remarks about their mother, from her subtle undermining of Finley's care for Phoebe to her overt resentment of the children's mere existence. Throughout the recitation, Silas remained silent, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger to a grief so profound it aged him before Finley's eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse. Finley looked away. "You were happy," he whispered. "After Mom. You seemed better with her. I didn't want to ruin it." A sound escaped Silas then, something between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, Finn, that wasn't your burden to carry." He sank back onto the bed, taking Finley's hand in his own. "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you both." "It's okay," Finley murmured, his eyelids growing heavy again. "You're here now." "Yes," Silas agreed, a new resolve hardening his voice. "And things are going to change. I promise you that." Finley wanted to ask what he meant, but exhaustion was pulling him back into darkness. He surrendered to it, comforted by his father's presence and the weight of truth finally unburdened. He dreamed of his mother again, but this time she was smiling, her hand cool against his cheek. "You did well, my brave boy," she seemed to say. "But it's not over yet." When Finley woke again, the room was darker, his flashlight having dimmed to a feeble glow. He was alone, Phoebe's chair empty, the house silent except for the continuing howl of the wind. His fever had broken, leaving him drenched in sweat but clearer-headed than he'd been in days. He pushed himself to a sitting position, wincing at the soreness in his muscles. "Dad?" he called, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Dad? Phoebe?" No answer. A tendril of unease worked its way through his chest. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, waited for a wave of dizziness to pass, then stood cautiously. The house felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still. Finley shuffled to the door and opened it, peering into the darkened hallway. "Dad?" he called again. "Where are you guys?" A faint sound reached him from downstairs, a key turning in a lock. Relief washed through him. His father must have gone outside for something, to check on neighbors, perhaps, or to clear the walkway. But the voice that floated up the stairs wasn't Silas's. "Hello? Anyone home?" Camille called, her tone artificially bright. "The roads were awful. We had to stay overnight at Diane's sister's place in Concord." Finley froze, his blood running cold. Where was his father? Where was Phoebe? Camille's footsteps moved through the downstairs rooms, accompanied by another set, Diane's heavier tread. "Silas," Camille called, a note of confusion entering her voice. "Your car's outside. Are you here?" Finley retreated into his room, closing the door silently. His mind raced. If Camille was just getting home, and his father's car was outside but Silas himself was nowhere to be found, where had they gone? And why would his father leave without telling him? Unless something had happened. Unless Phoebe had gotten worse somehow, and Silas had taken her for help. The thought sent a jolt of panic through Finley. He had to find out what was going on. Had to find Phoebe. He moved as quietly as he could to his closet, retrieving his heaviest sweater and pulling it over his pajamas. His winter boots were downstairs by the door, but his sneakers would have to do. He grabbed his flashlight, now barely glowing, and slipped back into the hallway. From below came the sound of Camille's voice, now edged with annoyance. "Where are those kids? Finley? Phoebe? Come down here right now." Finley hesitated at the top of the stairs. If he revealed himself, Camille would demand answers he didn't have about his father and sister's whereabouts. And without Silas present, he'd be at her mercy again. No, he had to find Phoebe, had to make sure she was safe. But how? Camille and Diane were between him and the front door. And in this weather, where could he possibly go? The Suttons. The elderly couple next door had always been kind to them, bringing over cookies when their mother died and offering Finley odd jobs like raking leaves or shoveling snow. If his father had needed help, that's where he might have gone. Decision made, Finley crept back to his room and eased open the window. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Snow had drifted against the side of the house, partially obscuring the view, but he could just make out the golden glow of candlelight from the Suttons' windows next door. They had power too. Getting there wouldn't be easy. The distance wasn't great, perhaps 50 yards between houses, but the snow was deep, and Finley was still weak from his fever. But what choice did he have? He began to climb out onto the small section of roof that covered the back porch, when a sound from outside his bedroom door made him freeze. "I'm telling you, I heard something up here," Diane was saying, her voice coming closer. "In the boys' room." "Finley," Camille called sharply. "Are you hiding from me?" "That's very childish." The doorknob turned. Finley made a split-second decision and dove behind the blanket fort, pulling the covers over himself just as the door swung open. Flashlight beams swept the room, passing over the rumpled bed and discarded washcloth. "He was here," Camille said, moving further into the room. "Look at the bed." "Maybe they're all together somewhere," Diane suggested. "The father came home early and took them out. In this weather? Don't be ridiculous." Camille's voice had lost its artificial sweetness, revealing the cold edge beneath. Besides, Silas would have called. He's obsessive about checking in. The flashlight beam came dangerously close to Finley's hiding place. He held his breath, pressing himself as flat as possible against the floor. "Well, they're not here now," Diane said impatiently. "Can we please go back downstairs? It's freezing up here without the heat." Camille made a sound of frustration. "Fine, but something's not right. Silas would never just leave like this, especially with the kids." The women retreated, their footsteps and voices receding down the hallway. Finley waited until he heard them descend the stairs before emerging from his hiding place, heart pounding. He needed to get to the Suttons now before Camille and Diane thought to check the neighboring houses. The window opened with a protesting creak that sounded deafening in the quiet room. Finley climbed through, his movements clumsy with lingering weakness, and found himself on the slippery, snow-covered porch roof. The wind hit him full force, cutting through his inadequate clothing like knives. Moving carefully, he made his way to the edge where a trellis, now barren of the climbing roses that covered it in summer, offered a precarious route to the ground. He'd used it before, on warmer days when he wanted to avoid Camille, sneaking out to read in the backyard or visit the Suttons' ancient golden retriever, Bailey. This time, the descent was treacherous. Ice coated the wooden lattice, making each handhold uncertain. Twice Finley nearly lost his grip, his heart leaping into his throat as he scrabbled for purchase. By the time his feet touched the snow-covered ground, his fingers were numb with cold and his pajama pants were soaked through. The snow was deeper than he'd anticipated, reaching halfway up his calves and spilling over the tops of his sneakers. Each step was an effort, his legs still weak from fever. The bitter wind drove icy particles against his exposed face like tiny needles, and within minutes, he could no longer feel his ears or nose. The distance to the Suttons' house seemed to grow rather than diminish as he struggled through the drifts. The golden glow from their windows was his beacon, the only point of warmth in a world gone white and hostile. Finley fixed his eyes on that light and pushed forward, one laborious step at a time. Time became meaningless in the storm's fury. It might have been minutes or hours. Finley couldn't tell. His thoughts grew sluggish, a new kind of delirium setting in, this one born of cold rather than fever. Only the need to find Phoebe kept him moving, an instinct more fundamental than conscious thought. When he finally reached the Suttons' back door, he was trembling so violently he could barely lift his arm to knock. The sound was feeble, almost lost in the howling wind. He tried again, using the last of his strength to pound against the wooden frame. The door swung open, spilling blessed warmth and light into the night. Dr. Harold Sutton stood framed in the doorway, his white hair wild and his lined face creased with concern. "Good Lord," he exclaimed, taking in Finley's bedraggled appearance. "Finley Wheeler? What on earth are you doing out in this storm?" "Phoebe," Finley managed through chattering teeth. "My D-Dad. Are they here?" "Esther," Dr. Sutton called over his shoulder, already pulling Finley inside. "It's the Wheeler boy. He's half frozen." Esther Sutton appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her soft, grandmotherly face registered shock, then immediate action. "Get him by the fire, Harold. I'll fetch blankets." The elderly doctor guided Finley to an armchair positioned close to a crackling fireplace. The warmth was so intense after the bitter cold that it hurt, a burning sensation prickling along Finley's skin as circulation painfully returned. "Your sister and father aren't here, son?" Dr. Sutton said, concern deepening the lines around his eyes. "We haven't seen either of them. What's happened?" Confusion and fear tangled in Finley's mind. If Phoebe and his father weren't here, where could they be? "I don't know," he admitted. "I was sick. Dad came home early because of the storm. Then I fell asleep, and when I woke up, they were gone." Esther returned with an armful of quilts which she proceeded to wrap around Finley with brisk efficiency. "And you thought they might be here? In this weather?" "I didn't know where else they would go," Finley said, the full weight of his situation beginning to register. His father and sister were missing. He was alone with his abusive stepmother and her friend. And he'd just exposed himself to hypothermia for nothing. "When did you last see them?" Dr. Sutton asked, his tone shifting subtly into what Finley recognized as his professional voice. Before retirement, Harold Sutton had been Millbrook's family doctor for over 40 years. He'd delivered Finley and treated his childhood earaches and chicken pox. He'd also been among the last to treat Lorelei before her case was transferred to specialists in Boston. "Last night, I think," Finley replied, trying to organize his still muddled thoughts. "I had a high fever. Dad was taking care of me. Phoebe was sleeping in my room." The elderly couple exchanged worried glances. "And your stepmother?" Esther prompted. "Where was she during all this?" "Out. Somewhere with her friend Diane." A sudden thought occurred to Finley. Maybe Dad took Phoebe to the hospital? Because of the storm and my fever? In case she got sick too. Dr. Sutton nodded slowly. "That's possible. The roads would have been treacherous. But if he was concerned enough," he turned to his wife. "Esther, try the hospital line. The landline might still be working even with the power out." As Esther moved to the old rotary phone mounted on the wall, Finley sank deeper into the quilts, exhaustion and residual illness catching up with him now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You should never have gone out in this weather, young man," Dr. Sutton scolded gently. "You could have frozen to death. What were you thinking?" "I had to find Phoebe," Finley murmured, the simplicity of the truth requiring no further explanation. The doctor's expression softened. "You're a good brother, Finley, but you need to take care of yourself too." He pressed a hand to Finley's forehead. "Your fever's coming back. Let me get you some aspirin." While Dr. Sutton rummaged in a nearby cabinet, Esther returned from the phone, her face troubled. "The line's dead," she reported. "Storm must have brought down the wires." "We'll try again later," the doctor assured Finley, returning with 2 pills and a glass of water. "For now, you need to rest and get warm. When the storm breaks, we'll figure out where your family has gone." Finley swallowed the medicine obediently, grateful for the Suttons' calm, practical approach. Here, at least, he was safe from Camille, even if only temporarily. "Should we let your stepmother know you're here?" Esther asked, seemingly reading his thoughts. "She must be worried sick about you." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through Finley. "No," he said quickly, then moderated his tone at Esther's surprised expression. "I mean, she already knows Dad and Phoebe are missing. If she knows I'm gone too, she'll just worry more." It wasn't entirely a lie. Camille would indeed be concerned, not about Finley's well-being, but about the questions that would inevitably arise if all 3 members of her family disappeared during her absence. "Well, you can stay here until we sort this out," Dr. Sutton declared, misinterpreting Finley's reluctance. No sense in anyone else venturing out in this weather. Esther's made a big pot of beef stew on the wood stove. Are you hungry? The mention of food awakened a hollow ache in Finley's stomach, reminding him that he'd barely eaten in days. Yes, sir, he admitted. Very hungry. I'll fetch you a bowl, Esther said, patting his shoulder. You sit tight by the fire. As the elderly couple moved toward the kitchen, conversing in low tones, Finley stared into the dancing flames. The fire's hypnotic movement reminded him of the water stains on the basement ceiling, the ones he'd transformed into fantastical landscapes for Phoebe's entertainment. The memory triggered a wave of anxiety. Where was his sister now? Was she safe? Warm? Fed? And his father, had something happened to him? Had he gone for help and gotten lost in the storm? The possibilities multiplied in Finley's mind, each more disturbing than the last. A soft nudge against his hand pulled him from these dark thoughts. Bailey, the Suttons' elderly golden retriever, had padded silently into the room and was now resting his graying muzzle on the arm of Finley's chair, roomy eyes gazing up with canine concern. Hey, Bailey, Finley whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Good boy. The simple comfort of the animal's presence loosened something tight in Finley's chest. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed now welled up, spilling silently down his cheeks. Bailey whined softly and pressed closer, as if understanding the boy's distress. By the time Esther returned with a steaming bowl of stew, Finley had composed himself, though the evidence of tears remained on his face. If the elderly woman noticed, she gave no sign, merely handing him the food and a spoon with a warm smile. Eat up, dear, she encouraged. Nothing like a hot meal to chase away the chill. The stew was delicious, rich and savory, with chunks of tender beef and vegetables. Finley ate slowly at first, unsure if his stomach could handle solid food after days of illness, but soon found himself devouring every bite with growing enthusiasm. More, Esther offered when he'd finished, clearly pleased by his appetite. No, thank you, Mrs. Sutton, Finley replied, manners reasserting themselves now that the worst of his hunger was satisfied. It was really good. You can call me Esther, dear. We've known you since you were born. She settled into a chair across from him, her knitting needles appearing from somewhere, clicking into a soothing rhythm. How have things been since your father remarried? We don't see much of your family these days. The question was casual, but Finley sensed an underlying concern. He hesitated, weighing his response. The Suttons had been neighbors for his entire life, friends of his parents long before his birth. If anyone might believe the truth about Camille, it would be them. But years of keeping silent, of protecting his father and managing his own problems, made honesty difficult. It's been an adjustment, he said finally, settling on a partial truth. Dad works a lot. Camille is still getting used to having kids around. Esther's needles paused momentarily. And how does she treat you and your sister when your father isn't home? The directness of the question startled Finley. Had the Suttons suspected something all along? Had they seen or heard evidence of Camille's true nature through adjoining walls or across connecting yards? Before he could formulate a response, the front door burst open, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and swirling snow. Dr. Sutton appeared from the kitchen, alarm visible on his face until he recognized the newcomer. Officer Donnelly, what brings you out in this weather? A police officer stomped snow from his boots in the entryway, his uniform barely visible beneath layers of winter gear. Dr. Sutton, he acknowledged, removing his snow-crusted hat. Sorry to bother you, but we're checking on residents, particularly the elderly. Power's out across most of the county, and it's not coming back anytime soon. His gaze fell on Finley, surprise registering in his expression. Finley Wheeler? What are you doing here, son? Finley recognized Officer Donnelly from community events and school presentations on safety. The man had a reputation for being fair but strict, particularly when it came to children's welfare. He came to us looking for his father and sister, Dr. Sutton explained. Apparently they've gone missing in the storm. The boy was sick with fever, and when he woke up, they were gone. We thought perhaps Silas might have taken the little girl to the hospital, but the phone lines are down, so we couldn't check. Officer Donnelly frowned, moving closer to the fire. That's strange timing. We just got a call from Millbrook General about a man and a little girl brought in a few hours ago. Car accident on Route 9. The man was unconscious, and the girl was too upset to give much information, but they had identification. Name of Wheeler. Finley's heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful intensity. Are they okay? He demanded, rising from his chair so abruptly that the quilts fell to the floor. Is Phoebe hurt? And my dad? Officer Donnelly held up a calming hand. The girl's fine, just scared and cold. The man, your father, I assume, hit his head pretty bad when the car slid off the road. He's still unconscious, but stable. The hospital's running on generator power, and they're swamped with storm-related injuries, which is why they called us to help locate next of kin. Relief and anxiety ward in Finley's chest. They were alive, but his father was hurt, and Phoebe was alone among strangers. I need to go to them, he declared. Phoebe will be terrified without me or Dad. Hold on, son, Officer Donnelly said, his tone gentle but firm. Nobody's going anywhere in this storm. The roads are completely impassable. Took me nearly an hour to get here from the station, and that's only a few blocks. The hospital staff will take good care of your sister until conditions improve. But she needs me, Finley insisted, desperation rising in his voice. She doesn't understand what's happening. She'll think everyone's abandoned her. The adults exchanged concerned glances, clearly sympathetic but unwilling to risk further danger. I understand how you feel, Officer Donnelly said, but we have to be practical. The best thing you can do for your sister right now is stay safe and warm until the storm passes. Then I'll personally take you to the hospital. Finley wanted to argue further, but exhaustion and lingering illness undermined his resolve. He sank back into the chair, shoulders slumping in defeat. Can you at least tell the hospital to let Phoebe know I'm okay? So she doesn't worry. I'll radio back to the station and have them relay the message, Officer Donnelly promised. Now, there's something else I need to ask you. Where is your stepmother during all this? She's at home, Finley replied. She just got back from being stuck at her friend's sister's house in Concord. She doesn't know about the accident. Someone should inform her, Dr. Sutton suggested. The poor woman must be frantic with her entire family missing. Finley bit back the urge to contradict this charitable assessment of Camille's likely state of mind. She has no way to get to the hospital either, he pointed out. And the phones are down. I'll stop by your house on my way back to the station, Officer Donnelly decided. I'd like to get a better understanding of the timeline anyway. When exactly did your father and sister leave the house? And why would they go out in such dangerous conditions? The questions stirred Finley's earlier confusion. Why had his father taken Phoebe out into the storm? Had his condition worsened so suddenly that Silas felt he had no choice? Or was there another reason? Perhaps something to do with what Finley had revealed during his feverish confession? I don't know, he admitted. I was really sick. Dad came home early because he couldn't reach us on the phone. I told him some things about Camille, about how she treats us when he's not around. Then I passed out. When I woke up, they were gone and Camille was just getting home. Officer Donnelly's expression sharpened with interest. What sort of things did you tell your father about your stepmother? Finley? The direct question caught Finley off guard. He glanced uncertainly at the Suttons, who were watching him with undisguised concern. It's okay, dear, Esther encouraged softly. You can tell us. A lifetime of keeping secrets, of protecting others at his own expense, made the words stick in Finley's throat. But the memory of Phoebe's small face, frightened in the basement darkness, gave him courage. She locks us in the basement sometimes, he said, his voice barely audible, as punishment, and she forgets to feed us when Dad's not home, or says she forgets, and she says mean things about our mom, and about us. She doesn't want us. The admission hung in the quiet room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Bailey's soft wine. The three adults exchanged glances loaded with meaning that Finley couldn't fully interpret. Concern, certainly, but also something that might have been guilt or regret. "How long has this been going on?" Officer Donnelly asked, his professional demeanor softening with compassion. "Since a few weeks after she moved in," Finley answered. "At first it was just little things, forgetting to pick us up from school, or making comments about how messy we are. But it got worse after Dad started working double shifts at the mill." "And your father had no idea?" Dr. Sutton asked incredulously. Finley shook his head. "Camille acts different when he's around. Like she really cares about us. And I didn't tell him because he seemed happier with her. After Mom died, he was so sad all the time. I didn't want to make things worse." Esther made a soft sound of distress, setting aside her knitting to reach for Finley's hand. "Oh, my dear boy, that wasn't your responsibility to bear." "No, it wasn't," Officer Donnelly agreed grimly. "But I think we may now understand why your father took your sister and left in such a hurry. If you told him about this abuse, and make no mistake, Finley, that's what it was, he might have been taking Phoebe somewhere he thought she'd be safe. Like Grandma's house in Oregon?" Finley suggested. His paternal grandmother lived on the opposite coast, a distance that had always seemed impossibly vast, especially after his mother's death had anchored them more firmly to Millbrook. "That would explain why they were on Route 9, Officer Donnelly mused. "It leads to the interstate. But in this weather," he shook his head. "He must have been desperate. Or angry," Finley thought but didn't say. He'd never seen his father truly angry. Not the kind of cold, righteous fury that might drive a man to bundle his daughter into a car during a blizzard and attempt to flee. The idea was both frightening and oddly comforting. Perhaps his father had finally seen Camille clearly, had finally chosen to protect his children even at great personal cost. "I need to report this," Officer Donnelly said, rising from his place by the fire. "Child Protective Services will want to investigate, though that may take some time given the current conditions." A new worry gnawed at Finley. "What happens now? To me and Phoebe?" "For tonight, you'll stay here with the Suttons," the officer decided. "I'll inform your stepmother of the accident and your whereabouts. Once the storm clears and road crews can get through, we'll get you to the hospital to see your father and sister. After that, well, we'll have to see what your father's condition is and what he wants to do." It wasn't a particularly reassuring answer, but it was honest. Finley appreciated that more than false promises would have been. "Thank you," he said quietly. Officer Donnelly nodded, replacing his hat and preparing to venture back into the storm. "Try to get some rest, son. You've been through a lot, and you're still recovering. Dr. Sutton, Mrs. Sutton, I'll be in touch as soon as I have more information." After the officer departed, a heavy silence fell over the room. Finley stared into the fire, overwhelmed by the day's revelations and the uncertain future that stretched before him. "He's right, you know," Dr. Sutton said gently. "You need rest. We have the guest room all made up. Why don't you try to sleep for a while? Things often look clearer after some rest." Finley wanted to protest that he couldn't possibly sleep with his father unconscious in a hospital bed and Phoebe frightened and alone. But his body betrayed him, a profound exhaustion seeping into his very bones. He nodded wearily, allowing Esther to lead him to a small but comfortable bedroom at the back of the house. "There's a bathroom right across the hall," she told him, turning down the quilt on a double bed that seemed impossibly luxurious after the basement floor and his own narrow twin. "I've left a toothbrush and some of Harold's old pajamas on the dresser. They'll be much too big, but at least they're dry." "Thank you," Finley said, the words inadequate for the kindness these neighbors had shown him. "For everything." Esther hesitated in the doorway, her lined face troubled. "I wish we'd known sooner, dear. We suspected something wasn't right. We hardly ever saw you children playing outside anymore, and when we did catch glimpses, you seemed diminished somehow. But we didn't want to interfere in another family's business." She sighed, regret evident in her voice. Sometimes being polite is just another word for being cowardly. The raw honesty of the admission struck Finley. He'd never considered that adults might have their own fears and uncertainties, their own hesitations about doing the right thing. It was a strange realization, both disturbing and oddly liberating. "It's okay," he offered, not sure if he was forgiving her or simply acknowledging the complexity of the situation. "Nobody really knew. I didn't want them to." Esther nodded sadly. "Get some sleep, Finley. We'll figure this out together." Left alone, Finley changed into the borrowed pajamas, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs multiple times until they more or less fit his small frame. He brushed his teeth mechanically, the simple act of dental hygiene a surreal contrast to the chaos of the past days. In the guest room, he slipped beneath blankets that smelled of lavender and sunshine, a scent so reminiscent of his mother's laundry that tears pricked his eyes again. Despite his racing thoughts and lingering anxiety, exhaustion claimed him almost immediately, pulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he woke, the quality of light in the room had changed. The storm's fury had diminished to a gentle snowfall visible through lace curtains. Somewhere in the house, voices murmured in conversation. The Suttons and someone else whose tone Finley couldn't immediately identify. He sat up, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings until memory rushed back. His father, Phoebe, the accident, Camille. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Finley," Esther called. "Are you awake, dear? There's someone here to see you." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, pushing back the covers. "I'll be right out." He found his own clothes, now dry, folded neatly on a chair by the bed. Dressing quickly, he tried to prepare himself for whatever new development awaited him. Had there been news from the hospital? Was his father conscious? Had Camille come to take him home? The last possibility sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the old house's walls. In the living room, Dr. Sutton sat conversing with a woman Finley didn't recognize. Middle-aged, with practical clothes and a kind face lined with fatigue. She stood when Finley entered, extending a hand. "Hello, Finley. I'm Janet Livingston from Child Protective Services. I understand you've had quite an ordeal." Finley shook her hand automatically, his mind racing to catch up with this new development. "Is my dad okay? And Phoebe?" "Your sister is fine," Janet assured him. "She's been asking for you. Your father regained consciousness early this morning, which is an excellent sign. He has a concussion and some minor injuries from the accident, but the doctors expect him to make a full recovery." Relief washed through Finley, so intense it made his knees weak. He sank into the nearest chair, trying to process the good news. "Can I see them?" "That's why I'm here," Janet said, resuming her seat. "The snow has let up enough that road crews have cleared the main routes. I can take you to the hospital now if you'd like." "Yes, please," Finley said immediately. "Just let me get my coat." "Actually, there's something we need to discuss first," Janet said, her tone growing more serious. "Officer Donnelly has shared some concerning information about your home situation. I'd like to hear directly from you what's been happening with your stepmother." Finley glanced uncertainly at the Suttons, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he began to talk, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as Janet listened without judgment or disbelief. He told her about the basement punishments, the neglect, the subtle psychological cruelty that was in some ways worse than outright abuse. Throughout his account, Janet took notes, occasionally asking for clarification but never questioning the veracity of his statements. "Thank you for being so honest," she said when he'd finished. "That took courage." Finley shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just want to make sure Phoebe is safe." "That's our priority too," Janet assured him. "Based on what you've told me and the preliminary report from Officer Donnelly, we've already taken steps to ensure that neither you nor your sister will be returning to your stepmother's care while we investigate these allegations." "What about my dad?" Finley asked anxiously. "He didn't know about any of this until I told him right before he left." "We'll need to talk with your father about that," Janet said carefully. "But from what I understand, he was attempting to remove your sister from the situation when the accident occurred. That suggests he was trying to protect her once he became aware of the danger." It was the confirmation Finley had been hoping for. His father had chosen them, had acted to keep Phoebe safe once he understood the truth. The knowledge settled something restless inside him, a fear he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was relieved. "So what happens now?" he asked, echoing his earlier question to Officer Donnelly. "Now we go to the hospital so you can see your family," Janet replied, rising from her chair. "The longer-term arrangements will depend on several factors, including your father's recovery and the findings of our investigation. But I promise you won't have to face any of this alone." Finley nodded, a cautious hope beginning to take root alongside his relief. For the first time in months, perhaps since his mother's diagnosis, he felt the burden of responsibility lightening, shared now with adults who seemed genuinely determined to help. As he thanked the Suttons and prepared to leave with Janet, Finley found himself thinking of the moment he'd woken in the dark house to find his father and sister gone. The panic and fear he'd felt then contrasted sharply with the tentative optimism he now experienced. Something had ended in that house during the blizzard. Not just his silent endurance of Camille's cruelty, but a chapter of his life defined by loss and the desperate attempt to hold what remained of his family together through sheer force of will. What would begin now, he couldn't yet imagine. But as he stepped out into the winter sunlight, the world transformed by snow into something clean and new, Finley allowed himself to believe that whatever came next might, against all odds, be better than what had come before. Millbrook General Hospital existed in a strange limbo between chaos and order. Despite the generator power keeping essential services running, sections of the building remained dark, illuminated only by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on institutional green walls. Nurses and doctors moved with efficient urgency, treating the influx of patients with storm-related injuries while battling the limitations of their compromised facilities. Finley followed Janet Livingston through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and institutional meals, his heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. They'd been directed to the pediatric ward on the 3rd floor, where Phoebe had been kept overnight for observation. "Your father is in a different section," Janet explained as they waited for the elevator, which was operating on emergency power and moving with agonizing slowness. "We'll see your sister first, then visit him. The doctors want to limit his visitors to short periods since he's still recovering from the concussion." Finley nodded, fingers fidgeting with the zipper of his coat. The Suttons had bundled him in extra layers before he'd left with Janet, including a scarf that Esther had insisted on wrapping twice around his neck to keep the pneumonia at bay. Their concern had been touching, if slightly overwhelming after months of Camille's calculated indifference. The elevator doors finally opened, and they stepped into a car occupied by a tired-looking nurse pushing an empty wheelchair. She nodded to Janet, recognition flickering in her eyes. "CPS, right? Here for the Wheeler kids. Just the boy for now," Janet confirmed. "How's the little girl doing this morning?" The nurse's expression softened. "Better. She slept through most of the night after we finally convinced her the bears wouldn't get her." "Bears?" Finley asked, alarmed. "She had a nightmare about being chased by bears," the nurse explained. "Took 3 of us to calm her down. Poor little thing was convinced they were hiding in the hospital basement." A cold knot formed in Finley's stomach. Phoebe's nightmare wasn't about random bears. It was about the basement monsters he'd invented in their darkest moments of confinement. Fierce creatures he'd assured her couldn't climb stairs or open doors, creating the illusion that the basement itself was their protector rather than their prison. "She's okay now, though?" he pressed. "Much better this morning. Been asking for her big brother every 5 minutes." The nurse smiled as the elevator doors opened on the pediatric floor. "She's in room 312, just down the hall on the right." Finley barely waited for Janet, hurrying ahead to the indicated room, his heart pounding with the need to see his sister, to confirm with his own eyes that she was truly safe and unharmed. He paused in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed by the clinical setting and the smallness of Phoebe within it. She sat cross-legged on a hospital bed too large for her diminutive frame, dressed in child-sized scrubs that had clearly been scrounged from hospital supplies. Her blonde curls were tangled, and dark shadows underlined her blue eyes, but she was unmistakably, blessedly whole. A coloring book lay open before her, and she was methodically filling in the outline of a princess with a purple crayon, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "Phoebe," Finley whispered, his voice catching. Her head snapped up, crayon freezing midstroke. For a heartbeat, she stared at him as if uncertain he was real. Then her face transformed with joy, crayons scattering as she scrambled off the bed. "Finley!" she screamed, launching herself across the room into his arms with such force that he staggered backward, catching her against his chest. She clung to him like a small monkey, arms and legs wrapped around him, face buried in his neck. Finley held her tightly, eyes closed against the sting of tears, breathing in the hospital soap smell of her hair mixed with the underlying scent that was uniquely, permanently Phoebe. "I thought the basement monsters got you," she whispered against his collar, her small body trembling. "Daddy said you were sleeping, but then he got hurt, and the doctors wouldn't tell me anything, and I thought." Her voice hitched with sobs. "I'm right here, Bug," Finley soothed, rubbing circles on her back. "I'm okay. And you're okay. We're both okay." He moved to the bed, sitting down with Phoebe still in his arms, unwilling to break the contact. Over her head, he met Janet's gaze, the social worker watching from the doorway with undisguised compassion. "The bears are basement monsters?" she asked quietly. Finley nodded, continuing to stroke Phoebe's hair as her sobs gradually subsided into hiccups. "It was a story I made up," he explained, keeping his voice low, "to make the basement less scary when we were locked down there." Janet's expression tightened, but she kept her voice neutral. "I see. Very creative." Phoebe pulled back slightly, scrubbing at her tear-stained face with small fists. "Are you sick anymore?" she demanded, examining Finley critically. "Daddy said you had a really bad fever." "I'm better now," Finley assured her. "The Suttons took care of me while you and Dad were here. How are you feeling? Did you get hurt in the car?" Phoebe shook her head solemnly. "I was wearing my seatbelt like you always tell me. But Daddy hit his head on the window, and there was blood, and he wouldn't wake up." Her lower lip trembled at the memory. "The ambulance men said he would be okay, but they took him away to a different room." "He is okay," Finley promised, though he hadn't yet seen his father himself. "He just needs to rest so his head can heal. Like when I fell off the swing and got a bump? Exactly like that. Only grown-ups take longer to heal sometimes." This explanation seemed to satisfy Phoebe, who settled more comfortably against Finley's side, her initial panic receding now that her brother was present and accounted for. She noticed Janet for the first time, eyeing the social worker with the natural wariness she developed toward unfamiliar adults. "This is Miss Livingston," Finley introduced. "She's here to help us." "Are you a doctor?" Phoebe asked skeptically. Janet smiled, approaching the bed slowly. "No, I'm a social worker. My job is to make sure children are safe and taken care of properly." Phoebe considered this. "Are you going to make us go back to Camille?" The directness of the question hung in the air, its implications painfully clear. Even at 4 years old, Phoebe understood that Camille represented a threat, a source of fear rather than protection. "No," Janet said firmly. "You don't have to worry about that. Right now, we're focused on helping your dad get better and making sure you and your brother are somewhere safe." "We're safe with Daddy," Phoebe declared, the childish certainty in her voice both heartbreaking and hopeful. "He said we didn't have to go back to the house ever again. He said he made a big mistake, but he was going to fix it." Finley exchanged glances with Janet, wondering when his father had said these things, what plans he might have been forming in those last conscious moments before the accident. Had he truly intended to leave Millbrook altogether? To take them away from the only home they'd ever known? The possibility was both frightening and exhilarating. "Would you like to see your father now?" Janet asked, checking her watch. "The doctors said we could visit briefly." Phoebe nodded eagerly, sliding off the bed. "Can I bring my picture? I was coloring it for him." "Of course," Janet agreed. "I'm sure he'd love to see it." As Phoebe gathered her crayons and the half-finished coloring page, Finley approached Janet, lowering his voice. "How bad is he really? You said he woke up, but..." "He has a moderate concussion, some facial lacerations from broken glass, and a dislocated shoulder," Janet replied quietly. Painful but not life-threatening. The main concern was the period of unconsciousness, but the CT scan showed no bleeding in the brain. He's groggy and disoriented, but the doctors are optimistic about a full recovery. Finley exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. And does he remember what happened? Why they were in the car? Janet hesitated. He was still a bit confused when I spoke with him earlier, but he was very clear about one thing. He wanted both of you kept away from your stepmother. He's prepared to file for emergency custody modification and a restraining order as soon as he's discharged. The confirmation of his father's intentions sent a wave of relief through Finley so powerful it made him lightheaded. His father believed him. His father was choosing them. After months of feeling invisible in his own home, the validation was almost overwhelming. Ready, Phoebe announced, brandishing her coloring page with pride. I made the princess's dress purple because Daddy says that was Mommy's favorite color. It's beautiful, Finley assured her, taking her free hand. Dad's going to love it. They followed Janet through the hospital corridors to a different wing, where the atmosphere grew noticeably more subdued. The adult patients here seemed to be those with more serious injuries, many from car accidents during the storm, according to the snippets of conversation Finley overheard among passing medical staff. Room 247 was a semi-private room, though the second bed stood empty. The privacy curtain was partially drawn around the occupied bed, where Silas Wheeler lay propped against pillows, his left arm in a sling and a stark white bandage covering a portion of his forehead. His face was a mosaic of small cuts and forming bruises, his normally healthy complexion ashen beneath the fluorescent lights. Despite his injuries, his eyes brightened immediately when they entered, focusing first on Phoebe, then shifting to Finley with visible relief. There are my kids, he said, his voice hoarse but warm. Best sight I've seen in days. Daddy! Phoebe broke away from Finley and rushed to the bedside, stopping just short of launching herself onto the mattress. I made you a picture. See? It's a princess with a purple dress like Mommy liked. It's perfect, pumpkin, Silas said, carefully accepting the drawing with his uninjured arm. We'll hang it up as soon as we get home. The promise hung awkwardly in the air, its fulfillment uncertain given the circumstances. Finley approached more cautiously than his sister, taking in the machines monitoring his father's vital signs. The IV line snaking into his right hand. Hey, Dad, he said softly. Silas's eyes filled with tears, an unusual display of emotion from a man who had stoically hidden his grief after losing his wife. Finley, he whispered, thank God you're okay. When I woke up here and they told me what happened, I've been so worried. I'm fine, Finley assured him, moving closer to the bed. The Suttons took care of me. How are you feeling? Like I drove into a ditch during a blizzard, Silas replied with a weak attempt at humor. But I'll heal. His expression grew serious. Finn, about what you told me. About Camille. Finley tensed, an automatic fear response to the mention of his stepmother. It was all true. I swear. I know it was, Silas said firmly. I believe you. I should have seen it myself. I should have protected you both better. His voice cracked with emotion. I'm so sorry, son. The simple acknowledgement, I believe you, unlocked something in Finley's chest that had been tightly contained for months. Tears spilled over before he could stop them, and he found himself enveloped in his father's one-armed embrace, careful of the IV but desperate in its intensity. It's okay, Silas murmured, his own voice thick with tears. It's going to be okay. I promise you. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Finley allowed himself to be comforted rather than being the comforter. He surrendered to the safety of his father's embrace, the solid reality of it washing away months of fear and vigilance. A small hand patted his back. Don't cry, Finley, Phoebe said anxiously. Daddy's not mad at you. I know, Bug, Finley replied, wiping his eyes as he straightened. These are good tears. Sometimes people cry when they're relieved or happy, not just when they're sad. Like when Mommy cried at your school play? Phoebe asked, her perfect recall of their mother sometimes startling Finley with its clarity. She said those were happy tears too. Just like that, Silas confirmed, his gaze lingering on Finley with a mixture of pride and regret. Your brother is the bravest person I know, Phoebe. He took such good care of you when I wasn't doing my job properly. He makes the best pancakes, Phoebe agreed solemnly, with faces on them. The simple childhood assessment lightened the moment, drawing watery chuckles from both Finley and his father. Janet, who had been observing from near the door, stepped forward. Mr. Wheeler, I don't want to tire you out, but I wanted to update you on the next steps. The police have taken a statement from your son regarding the allegations of neglect and inappropriate discipline by your wife. They're attempting to interview her now, but I understand she's being uncooperative. Silas's expression hardened. That doesn't surprise me. What happens with my children in the meantime? Given the circumstances, we've arranged temporary emergency foster placement with Dr. and Mrs. Sutton, Janet explained. They've been approved as emergency foster parents previously, and they specifically requested to take the children when they heard about the situation. Once you're discharged, we'll need to reevaluate. How long will that be? Finley asked anxiously. At least another day for observation, Silas replied. Maybe 2. The doctors are worried about delayed symptoms from the concussion. He turned to Janet. And Camille? What's happening with her? There's an ongoing investigation, Janet said carefully, with a glance at the children. Officer Donnelly has been in contact with the district attorney's office. They'll determine whether criminal charges are appropriate based on the evidence collected. The implications of this hung in the air, that Camille might face not just the dissolution of her marriage but legal consequences for her treatment of the children. Finley felt a complex mixture of emotions at the thought, vindication, certainly, but also a strange, unexpected pang of sadness for what might have been. I've already spoken with a lawyer, Silas said, his voice strengthening with resolve. As soon as I'm out of here, I'm filing for divorce and sole custody. I don't want her within 100 miles of my kids ever again. The fierce protectiveness in his tone was both reassuring and, in its timing, painful. Where had this determination been months ago, when Camille first began showing her true colors? But Finley pushed the thought away. His father knew now. He was acting now. That was what mattered. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, but Mr. Wheeler needs to rest now. Doctor's orders. Janet nodded, motioning to the children. We should go. Phoebe, say goodbye to your dad for now. We'll come back tomorrow. Phoebe's face crumpled with immediate distress. I don't want to leave. I want to stay with Daddy. The hospital isn't a good place for little girls to sleep, Silas explained gently. You'll be much more comfortable with the Suttons. They have that nice golden retriever, remember? Bailey? But what if you get scared without me? Phoebe persisted, her fear of separation painfully evident. I'll be just fine, Silas assured her. And I'll see you tomorrow. Maybe you can bring me another beautiful picture. The suggestion seemed to satisfy Phoebe, though she insisted on a prolonged goodbye hug and made Silas promise 3 separate times that he would still be there when they returned. Finally, with Janet's patient guidance, they prepared to leave. Finley, Silas called as they reached the door. Can I talk to you alone for just a minute? Janet hesitated, then nodded. We'll wait just outside the door, she said, leading Phoebe into the hallway. Finley returned to his father's bedside, uncertain what private message warranted delaying his much-needed rest. I need you to know something, Silas said, his voice low and urgent. What happened with Camille? Bringing her into our lives, not seeing what she was doing to you both. It's the biggest mistake I've ever made. I was so lost after your mother died that I grabbed onto the first person who offered a way out of the grief. That wasn't fair to you or Phoebe. It's okay, Dad, Finley began, uncomfortable with his father's raw vulnerability. No, it's not, Silas interrupted firmly. But I'm going to make it right. I've been thinking about what happens after I get out of here. This town. There are too many memories now. Good ones with your mother, but bad ones too. I think we might need a fresh start. You mean, Leave Millbrook? The possibility both excited and terrified Finley. Millbrook was the only home he'd ever known, containing all his memories of his mother, his school friends, the familiar landmarks of his childhood. But it also now held darker associations. The basement, Camille's cold eyes, the feeling of being trapped and helpless. My brother's been after me for years to move to Oregon, join him in his construction business, Silas continued. Better opportunities there than a dying mill town. We'd be closer to your grandmother too. But it's a big decision, and I won't make it without talking to you first. You and Phoebe have been through enough changes already. The consideration implicit in this statement that Finley's opinion mattered, that his father was thinking of their needs rather than just his own, felt like another step in the healing that had begun with Silas's earlier acknowledgement of his mistakes. I think, Finley said slowly, that it might be good to start over somewhere new, somewhere without basements. Silas's expression tightened with pain, but he nodded. No basements, he agreed. And no more making you be the grown-up, Finn. That's my job. I know I let you down, but I swear to you, I'm gonna do better. You deserve to be a kid again. The promise touched something deep in Finley's heart, a longing he'd barely allowed himself to acknowledge, for the simple security of childhood, the freedom to rely on adults rather than being relied upon. Could he still find his way back to that, after everything? Get some rest, Dad, he said, impulsively leaning down to hug his father again. We'll figure it all out later. In the hallway, he found Janet and Phoebe waiting patiently, the latter now clutching a small stuffed bear that hadn't been there before. One of the nurses brought it for her, Janet explained, seeing Finley's questioning look. Apparently they keep a supply for pediatric patients. Are you ready to go? Finley nodded, taking Phoebe's free hand. As they walked back through the hospital corridors toward the exit, he felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth after so long had physically unburdened him. Outside, the world had transformed into a crystalline landscape of white and blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind pristine snowdrifts and a sky of such perfect clarity it almost hurt to look at it. The sun reflected blindingly off the snow, turning ordinary Millbrook into something magical and new. Janet's car, a practical sedan with snow tires, waited in the hospital parking lot, already warming up thanks to a remote starter. As they approached, Finley noticed another vehicle parked nearby, a police cruiser with Officer Donnelly visible behind the wheel. What's he doing here? Finley asked Janet, anxiety spiking. He's escorting us back to the Suttons, Janet explained. Just a precaution. The implication was clear. They were being protected in case Camille tried to interfere. The thought sent a chill through Finley that had nothing to do with the winter air. Has she tried to see us? He asked quietly, making sure Phoebe was distracted with her new bear. Janet hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was the best approach. She came to the hospital earlier, demanding to see your father and sister. Security had to escort her out when she became disruptive. That's why we have the police escort, just to be safe. The knowledge that Camille was still a threat, still trying to assert control over their lives, dampened some of Finley's newfound optimism. But there was comfort in the visible evidence of protection. The police cruiser, Janet's steady presence, the knowledge that multiple adults now stood between his family and his stepmother's capacity for harm. The drive to the Suttons' house was peaceful, Phoebe chattering happily to her new bear, which she had named Hospital, despite Finley's attempts to suggest more conventional names. Janet answered her endless questions with patient good humor, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that felt like a gift after the chaos of recent days. The Suttons' Victorian home, similar to the Wheelers in architecture but warmly maintained rather than neglected, stood as welcoming as Finley remembered it, smoke curling from the chimney and windows glowing with lamplight in the early winter dusk. Power had not yet been restored to much of Millbrook, but the Suttons were well prepared for such outages with their wood stove and generous supply of candles. Esther greeted them at the door with the enthusiasm of a grandmother receiving beloved grandchildren, ushering them into the warmth with exclamations over how cold they must be and immediate offers of hot chocolate. Bailey, the golden retriever, padded over to investigate the newcomers, his tail wagging gently as he sniffed at Phoebe's extended hand. "He's so soft," she whispered, clearly entranced. "Can I pet him?" "Of course, dear," Esther assured her. "Bailey loves children. He's a very gentle old fellow." As Phoebe became acquainted with the dog, supervised by Dr. Sutton, who had emerged from his study at their arrival, Janet took Finley and Esther aside for a quiet conversation. "I've explained the situation to Finley, but Phoebe is still a bit confused about what's happening," she told Esther. "She knows she'll be staying with you until her father is discharged from the hospital, but she may have questions or concerns, particularly around bedtime. We'll do everything we can to make her feel secure," Esther promised. "Harold's already set up the guest room next to Finley's for her, with a night light and the door left open so she won't feel alone. And we thought we might let Bailey sleep upstairs tonight. He usually stays in the kitchen, but children often find pets comforting in strange places." The thoughtfulness of these preparations touched Finley deeply. The Suttons had clearly given careful consideration to what might make two traumatized children feel safe in their home. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of his gratitude. Esther patted his cheek gently. "You're very welcome, dear." After reviewing emergency contact information and confirming arrangements for another hospital visit the following day, Janet prepared to leave. She knelt to say goodbye to Phoebe, who had already developed a comfortable rapport with the social worker. "I'll see you tomorrow when we go visit your dad," Janet promised. "If you need anything before then, Mrs. Sutton has my phone number." "Will you bring hospital another friend?" Phoebe asked hopefully, displaying her bear. "He's lonely," Janet laughed. "I'll see what I can do. Be good for the Suttons. Okay?" With a final reassuring nod to Finley, she departed, leaving the children in the care of the elderly couple who already seemed to be embracing their temporary guardianship with wholehearted enthusiasm. The evening passed in a blur of simple comforts: hot chocolate with marshmallows, a hearty chicken stew that Esther had kept warm on the wood stove, and a game of checkers that Dr. Sutton taught Phoebe to play with exaggerated seriousness, letting her win while making a great show of his dismay at being defeated by a 4-year-old. Throughout it all, Finley observed his sister for signs of distress or confusion, but she seemed to be adapting to their new circumstances with the resilience of young children. The warm welcome, the gentle dog, the undemanding affection of the Suttons, all combined to create an environment where Phoebe could begin to relax her own vigilance, mirroring Finley's earlier relief at no longer needing to be constantly on guard. Bedtime brought a momentary crisis when Phoebe realized she didn't have her usual stuffed rabbit, left behind in their hasty departure from the Wheeler house. But Esther quickly produced a substitute, a well-loved plush cat that had belonged to her own daughter decades earlier. "This is Marmalade," she told Phoebe solemnly. "She's very good at keeping away bad dreams. Would you like to borrow her until we can get your rabbit back?" Phoebe considered the offer seriously, examining the cat with critical eyes before nodding her acceptance. "She can sleep with hospital," she decided, "so they can be friends." With this diplomatic solution achieved, the bedtime routine proceeded smoothly. Esther had found a collection of children's books in her attic, preserved from her own children's youth, and Dr. Sutton proved to be an animated storyteller, complete with different voices for each character. Finley, granted the unprecedented luxury of not being responsible for his sister's bedtime routine, found himself at loose ends. He wandered into the Suttons' small library, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves housed a collection as eclectic as it was extensive. Running his fingers along the spines, he selected a volume of adventure stories that reminded him of ones his mother used to read to him. He had settled into an armchair with the book when Esther found him some time later, Phoebe having finally succumbed to sleep. "There you are," she said warmly. "Finding something good to read?" Finley nodded, showing her the book. "My mom used to read these to me before she got sick." Esther's expression softened with understanding. "She loved books, your mother. I remember her at the library book sales, always coming home with more than she could carry. Lorelei had such a beautiful way of reading aloud. She volunteered for story time at the library, you know." "I didn't know that," Finley admitted, hungry for any new detail about his mother. any fragment of her life he might have missed or forgotten. Oh yes, she had all the children entranced. Esther settled into the chair opposite him. You're very like her, you know? Not just in looks, though you have her eyes, but in spirit. That fierce protective instinct, that creativity, that quiet strength. She would be so proud of the way you've cared for your sister. The comparison to his mother, offered so naturally and with such certainty, filled Finley with a warmth that spread through his chest like sunlight. Do you really think so? I know so, Esther affirmed. Lorelei was one of the strongest people I've ever known. Not the showy kind of strength, but the kind that endures, that puts others first without losing oneself. You have that same quality. Finley absorbed this, turning the pages of the book absently as he considered the idea that he might have inherited something of his mother beyond her physical features, that some essential part of her lived on in him, in the choices he made and the person he was becoming. Your father called while you were in here, Esther continued. He wanted to make sure you and Phoebe were settled in comfortably. I told him you were both doing well. Is he okay? Finley asked anxiously. Did something happen? No, Esther assured him. Just being a worried father. It's a good sign, actually. He's thinking more clearly now, focusing on you children rather than himself. That's progress. The observation echoed Finley's own earlier thoughts, that something fundamental had shifted in his father, a reawakening of the protective instinct that had been dormant since Lorelei's death. He said he wants to move us to Oregon, Finley said, testing the idea aloud. After he gets out of the hospital, for a fresh start. What do you think about that? Esther asked, her tone carefully neutral. Finley considered the question. I think it might be good to be somewhere new, somewhere without so many bad memories. He paused, then added quietly, but I'll miss the good memories too, of Mom, and this house, and you and Dr. Sutton. Oh, my dear boy, Esther said, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Memories travel with you, you know, the good ones and the bad. And as for us, well, telephones and letters still exist. Distance doesn't have to mean goodbye forever. The reassurance eased something in Finley's heart. Will you tell me more about my mom sometime? Stories I might not know. I would be delighted to, Esther promised. Your mother and I had many lovely conversations over tea while you children played in the yard. I could tell you about the time she organized that protest to save the old elm trees on Main Street, or how she once talked the principal into letting her start a mother's book club at the elementary school. The idea that there were still new things to learn about his mother, still ways to connect with her memory that he hadn't explored, felt like finding an unexpected gift. I'd like that a lot, he said softly. As the evening deepened into night, Finley found himself yawning despite his interest in continuing the conversation. Esther noticed immediately. Off to bed with you, she instructed gently. It's been an overwhelming day, and your body is still recovering from that fever. Sleep is the best medicine. Finley didn't argue, his newfound ability to accept care rather than provide it still novel enough to feel like a luxury. He allowed Esther to fuss over him a bit, making sure he had enough blankets, bringing him a glass of water for his nightstand, checking that the bathroom light was left on so he could find his way in an unfamiliar house. In the comfortable guest room, with the door left ajar so he could hear Phoebe if she needed him in the night, Finley lay awake for a time, processing the extraordinary events of the past days. From imprisonment in the basement to rescue, from his father's accident to his awakening, both literal and metaphorical, from silent endurance to open acknowledgement of the truth, it was almost too much to comprehend. Yet beneath the whirlwind of external changes, Finley sensed something internal shifting as well, a recalibration of his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For so long, he had defined himself by his responsibilities, by the necessity of being older than his years, by the burden of protection he carried for Phoebe. Now, unexpectedly, he was being offered the chance to reclaim something of his interrupted childhood, to surrender some of that burden to adults who were ready to shoulder it. The adjustment wasn't simple or immediate. Habits of vigilance and self-reliance formed over months couldn't be discarded in a day. But the possibility existed, a door opening onto a future he hadn't dared to imagine. As sleep finally claimed him, Finley's last conscious thought was of his mother, not as he'd last seen her, diminished by illness and pain, but as she'd been in her strongest moments, reading aloud with expressive gestures, her voice bringing stories to life. In his mind's eye, she smiled at him with pride and love, a benediction carried from memory into dreams. Spring came early to Millbrook that year, as if to compensate for the brutal winter. By mid-March, crocuses pushed through the remaining patches of snow, and the air carried the first hints of thaw and renewal. Finley stood on the Suttons' back porch, watching Phoebe and Bailey play an elaborate game of fetch in the newly visible grass. His sister's laughter rang out clear and uninhibited as the old dog retrieved the tennis ball with dignified enthusiasm, bringing it back to her with tail wagging. 3 months had passed since the blizzard that had changed everything. 3 months of gradual healing, of adjustments both large and small, of rebuilding a family shattered by loss and betrayal. Silas had been discharged from the hospital after 4 days, moving into a small apartment rented month to month, while the legal proceedings against Camille progressed. The children had remained with the Suttons initially, visiting their father daily as he recovered from his physical injuries, and began the harder work of addressing his emotional ones with the help of a grief counselor. The investigation into Camille's treatment of the children had been swift and decisive, resulting in criminal charges of child endangerment and neglect. She had left town before the case went to trial, forfeiting her bail and presumably fleeing back to Boston where she had family. The district attorney had decided not to pursue extradition, considering the children's well-being and the desire to spare them the trauma of testifying in court. The divorce had been finalized with remarkable speed given the circumstances, leaving Silas with full custody and no further legal ties to the woman who had briefly been his wife. The Wheeler house, with its too many memories both good and terrible, had been sold to a young couple from Boston looking for affordable property within commuting distance of the city. And now, on this clear March afternoon, they stood on the cusp of another change, the move to Oregon, scheduled for the following week. The decisions had been made, the arrangements finalized. Silas's brother had found them a small house to rent near his own, a single-story ranch with a large backyard and, as promised, no basement. "Are you ready for the big adventure?" Finley turned to find his father standing in the doorway behind him, looking more like his old self than he had in months. The physical injuries from the accident had healed, leaving only a faint scar above his right eyebrow. The emotional healing had been slower but steady, grief counseling helping him process not only Lorelei's death but his own failures in its aftermath. "I think so," Finley replied, making room for Silas on the porch steps. "Phoebe's excited about flying on an airplane and seeing the ocean." "And you?" Silas asked, settling beside him. "How are you feeling about it all?" The question reflected his father's new attentiveness, his conscious effort to check in with Finley's emotional state rather than assuming or overlooking it. Small changes, but meaningful ones. "A little scared," Finley admitted. "But good scared, I think. Like at the beginning of a book when you don't know what's going to happen but you're ready to find out." Silas smiled at the literary comparison. "That's a perfect way to put it." He watched Phoebe's game with Bailey for a moment before adding, "Your mom would have loved Oregon, you know. She always talked about wanting to see the redwood forests and the Pacific coast. Maybe this way we're taking a little piece of her with us, doing something she would have enjoyed." The thought was comforting, that their move might honor Lorelei's memory rather than abandoning it. "I'd like to think that," Finley agreed. The past months had brought many such conversations, as Silas deliberately broke the silence that had surrounded Lorelei's memory after her death. He shared stories Finley had never heard, found photographs that had been packed away in grief, and encouraged both children to talk about their memories of their mother. The effect had been healing, gradually transforming Lorelei from a painful absence into a beloved presence whose influence continued in their lives. "Dr. and Mrs. Sutton are going to miss you both terribly," Silas observed, watching as Esther emerged from the house to join Phoebe's game, producing treats for Bailey from her apron pocket. "They've been incredible." Finley nodded, unable to fully express what the elderly couple had come to mean to him. Beyond providing physical shelter during the crisis, they had offered emotional refuge and invaluable perspective. Dr. Sutton's patient wisdom and Esther's practical warmth had created a bridge between Finley's premature adulthood and the childhood he was slowly reclaiming. "We'll keep in touch," he said. "Esther's already making me promise to write every week. And she wants pictures of our new house and the mountains and everything." "We'll make sure she gets them," Silas promised. "And maybe in the summer they can come visit us." Dr. Sutton mentioned he's always wanted to see Crater Lake. The idea of maintaining these connections even across the distance reassured Finley. He'd worried that leaving Millbrook meant leaving behind everyone and everything familiar, but was beginning to understand that relationships could endure beyond physical proximity. "Dad," he said suddenly, a question that had lingered unexpressed for months finally finding voice. "Do you think we're going to be okay? Really okay, I mean, after everything?" Silas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing to offer platitudes. "I think," he said finally, "that we've all been through something difficult and painful that has changed us. We won't go back to how things were before your mom got sick. That's not possible. But I believe we can find a new kind of okay, one that honors what we've been through and what we've learned." He put an arm around Finley's shoulders, the casual physical affection another change from the emotionally distant father of recent years. "I know I've let you down, carried too much for too long. But I see you, Finn. I see how strong you've been and how much you've sacrificed for Phoebe. For me too. And I promise you won't have to be the grown-up anymore." The words, simple, direct, acknowledging, eased something in Finley that had been tightly wound for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without that tension. He leaned slightly into his father's side, accepting the comfort offered. "I'm proud of you," Silas continued softly. "So proud. And I know your mom would be too." Before Finley could respond, Phoebe's voice called from the yard, bright with excitement. "Finley! Daddy! Come see." Bailey caught the ball in the air. "We're coming, Bug," Finley called back, exchanging a smile with his father as they rose simultaneously. As they descended the porch steps to join the impromptu celebration of the elderly dog's surprising agility, Finley felt a momentary sense of displacement. Not unpleasant, but strange. For so long, his existence had been defined by crisis and survival, by the constant vigilance required to protect Phoebe and himself from Camille's cruelty. Now, in this ordinary moment of family life, with its simple pleasures and easy affection, he glimpsed the shape of their future. Different from what he had imagined, certainly. Marked by loss and hardship, yes, but also resilient, also healing, also capable of joy. Phoebe ran to meet them, her blonde curls bouncing in the spring sunlight. "Did you see him? He jumped so high." "He's very impressive for an old fellow," Silas agreed, lifting her into his arms with his now-healed shoulder. "Almost as impressive as you." She giggled, secure in her father's embrace, then reached out a hand toward Finley. "You throw the ball next. You can throw it super far." Finley accepted the slightly slobbery tennis ball, the weight of it familiar in his hand. He glanced at the elderly dog waiting expectantly, at Esther Sutton watching them all with grandmotherly affection, at his father holding Phoebe with the protective instinct finally, properly awakened. Then he drew back his arm and threw the ball with all his strength, sending it soaring into the clear blue sky of early spring, into the promise of a future they would face together. The house in Coos Bay, Oregon was precisely as promised. A modest ranch-style home with no basement, situated on a quiet street just 10 minutes' drive from the Pacific Ocean. What the real estate listing hadn't mentioned was the quality of light. How the coastal sunshine filtered through tall pines to create patterns on the hardwood floors, or how the fog rolled in some mornings to transform the familiar landscape into something mysterious and new. Finley stood at his bedroom window, watching the mist gradually dissipate as the summer sun strengthened. 6 months in their new home had brought changes he couldn't have anticipated. Not just external circumstances, but internal shifts in how he saw himself and his place in the world. School had ended for the summer 2 weeks earlier, giving him freedom to explore the coastal town that was gradually becoming home. He had made a few friends, other kids who shared his interests in books and the outdoors, who didn't know him as the boy whose mother died, or the kid with the awful stepmother. Here, he could define himself anew. Phoebe had blossomed in the move, her natural resilience helping her adapt quickly to their new environment. She attended a preschool program where she had become something of a storyteller among her peers, elaborating fantastical tales clearly influenced by the stories Finley had told her during their darkest times. The basement monsters had been transformed in her imagination into sea creatures that helped lost children find their way home, a therapeutic reimagining that her counselor had encouraged. Their father had perhaps changed the most dramatically. Working alongside his brother in the construction business had given Silas not only financial stability but physical outlets for his long-suppressed grief and anger. The outdoor work had restored color to his face and strength to his frame. But more importantly, he had embraced his role as an active parent with a dedication that sometimes moved Finley to unexpected tears. Not because of what he received, but because of what Phoebe would now experience. A father fully present in her life. A knock at his bedroom door interrupted Finley's reflections. "Come in," he called, turning from the window. Silas entered, already dressed for the day's planned excursion to the beach. "Morning, Finn. Sleep okay?" The question wasn't merely casual. Finley still occasionally experienced nightmares that left him shaking and disoriented. Dreams of darkness and confinement that the therapists they both saw said were normal responses to trauma. But they had decreased in frequency as the months passed, as security and routine replaced fear and uncertainty. "Pretty good," Finley confirmed. "I finished that book Uncle Jack lent me, the one about building treehouses." Silas grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "Perfect timing. He's coming over after our beach day to help us start planning yours. If you still want one." The treehouse had been Silas's idea, a project they could work on together throughout the summer, creating something uniquely Finley's in their new home. The thought of having a space that was elevated, open to light and air, seemed like the perfect antidote to the basement memories that still occasionally surfaced. "Definitely," Finley affirmed. "Is Phoebe up yet?" "Been up for hours," Silas replied with a rueful smile. "She's already packed her bucket and shovel, had breakfast, and informed me that today she's going to find a mermaid scale to send to Esther for her collection." The Suttons remained a consistent presence in their lives despite the distance. Weekly phone calls, letters decorated with Phoebe's artwork, and promised visits kept the connection strong. Dr. Sutton had even consulted with their new pediatrician to ensure continuity of care, particularly regarding the lingering respiratory issues Finley had developed following his winter fever. "She's convinced the last shell we found was a mermaid's hairbrush," Finley said, smiling at his sister's persistent imagination. "I didn't have the heart to tell her it was just a broken sand dollar." "Sometimes a little magic is good for the soul," Silas observed, the simple wisdom reflecting his own growth through counseling. "You about ready to head out? Tide's going out, so we'll have plenty of beach to explore." Finley nodded, reaching for the lightweight jacket that Oregon coastal weather necessitated even in summer. "I'll be down in a minute." Left alone, he completed his preparations for the day with the efficiency that remained part of his nature, though no longer driven by desperate necessity. As he moved around his room, a space he had been allowed to decorate himself, choosing the blue paint for the walls and the star-patterned comforter for the bed, Finley's eye caught on an object sitting on his desk. The notebook had been a gift from Esther Sutton just before they left Millbrook. "For your stories," she had told him, pressing it into his hands. "The ones you used to tell Phoebe in the basement. They shouldn't be lost." At first, Finley had been reluctant to revisit those tales, so inextricably linked with a time of fear and confinement. But gradually, encouraged by his therapist, he had begun to write them down, not just as he had told them to Phoebe, but expanded and transformed, the act of retelling becoming a way to reclaim control over the narrative of his own experience. He picked up the notebook now, flipping through pages filled with his increasingly confident handwriting. The stories had evolved beyond their original purpose as distraction and comfort. They had become something else, an exploration of courage, of siblings protecting each other, of finding light in darkness. His language arts teacher had been particularly impressed with one about sky pirates, suggesting Finley consider submitting it to a young writers contest sponsored by the local library. The idea both terrified and excited him. To share these stories, born in such difficult circumstances, with others who might find in them echoes of their own struggles and hopes. It was a vulnerability he was still learning to embrace. Phoebe's voice called up the stairs, bright with impatience. "Finley, come on. The mermaids won't wait all day." He smiled, tucking the notebook into his backpack on impulse. Perhaps he could work on the Sky Pirate story while Phoebe built her sandcastles. Perhaps Queen Lorelei needed a new adventure. Downstairs, he found his sister and father waiting by the door, Phoebe bouncing with excitement in her pink sun hat and Silas checking that they had sunscreen, water, and snacks for the day ahead. "Finally!" Phoebe exclaimed, grabbing Finley's hand. "I saved you a banana for breakfast because Daddy said we couldn't leave until you ate something." "Thanks, Bug," Finley said, accepting the slightly bruised fruit with appropriate solemnity. "Very thoughtful of you." As they piled into the car, a newer, safer model than the one that had carried them through the blizzard months ago, Finley caught his father's eye in the rearview mirror. The understanding that passed between them required no words. Acknowledgement of how far they had come, gratitude for their present peace, determination to move forward together. The drive to the beach was filled with Phoebe's chatter and the radio playing softly in the background. Finley ate his banana and watched the coastal landscape pass by, so different from the New England environment of his early childhood, yet becoming familiar in its own right. The towering pines, the glimpses of ocean between hills, the small coastal businesses with their weathered signs, all were becoming landmarks in this new chapter of their lives. At the beach, they established their base on a relatively isolated stretch of sand, spreading out towels and setting up the small shade tent that protected Phoebe's fair skin from the strengthening summer sun. Then they divided to pursue their individual interests, Silas taking a long walk along the shoreline to collect driftwood for a project he'd been planning, Phoebe immediately beginning an elaborate sand construction with her bucket and shovel, and Finley settling under the edge of the tent with his notebook and pencil. The sound of waves provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts, the rhythmic wash against the shore both constant and ever-changing. Finley opened his notebook to a fresh page, considering how to develop the story of Queen Lorelei and her sky pirates further. Perhaps they needed a mission, something challenging but ultimately triumphant. As he began to write, Finley felt the familiar flow of creativity taking over, the words coming more easily now than they had in the beginning. The pirates took shape under his pencil, their flying ships sailing through cloud formations and star fields, their young stowaway, a boy not unlike himself, finding his courage in the face of unexpected dangers. He was so absorbed in the narrative that he didn't immediately notice Phoebe abandoning her sand castle to sit beside him, her small face curious as she peered at the moving pencil. "Are you writing a story?" she asked, carefully not touching the page but following the words with her eyes. "Mum," Finley confirmed, "about Queen Lorelei and the Sky Pirates." Phoebe's eyes widened with recognition and delight. "From the basement. I remember them." She settled more comfortably against his side. "Can you read it to me?" The request gave Finley momentary pause. Would revisiting these stories trigger difficult memories for his sister? But Phoebe's expression held only anticipation, the basement now distant enough in her experience to be simply the setting for stories she had enjoyed rather than a place of fear. "Sure," he agreed, turning back to the beginning of the section he'd been working on. Queen Lorelei of the Sky Pirates stood at the bow of her flying ship, the Star Chaser, her flaming red hair streaming behind her in the wind as they approached the Cloud Kingdom. Phoebe listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting questions or suggestions that Finley incorporated into the narrative, the story becoming a collaboration between them. By the time Silas returned from his walk, arms full of interesting pieces of driftwood, they were deep in an adventure involving cloud dragons and a hidden treasure map. "Sounds exciting," their father commented, settling on the adjacent towel with genuine interest. "Mind if I listen too?" The simple request reflected another change in their family dynamic, Silas's willingness to enter his children's world rather than expecting them to adapt to his adult perspective. Finley nodded, secretly pleased by the additional audience, and continued the tale with increasing confidence. As the story reached its climactic scene, with the young stowaway helping Queen Lorelei navigate through a dangerous storm to reach the hidden Sky Island, Finley was struck by a sudden realization. These stories, born in darkness and confinement, had transcended their origins. They had become not just a means of escape but a testament to resilience, to the power of imagination to transform even the bleakest circumstances into something meaningful. And now, sitting on a sun-drenched beach with his sister pressed against one side and his father listening attentively on the other, Finley understood something his 10-year-old self could not have comprehended during those basement hours. That healing wasn't about forgetting the darkness but about finding the light within it and carrying that forward. And as the Star Chaser landed softly on the hidden island, its crew realized they had found something far more valuable than the treasure they'd been seeking. He read, the words flowing from his pencil with newfound purpose. They had found a place where lost children could be safe, where sky pirates who had once been lonely or afraid could belong to something larger than themselves. A family chosen not by blood, but by courage and loyalty and love. Phoebe sighed contentedly, leaning more heavily against him. I like that ending, she declared. It's happy but also a little bit sad. The best stories usually are, Silas observed, his voice gentle with understanding. Finley closed the notebook, conscious of having reached a kind of resolution not just in the narrative but in something deeper within himself. The basement would always be part of their history, the fear, the confinement, the desperate struggle to protect what mattered most. But it would not define their future. Race you to the water, Phoebe suddenly declared, scrambling to her feet and dashing toward the waves. No farther than your knees, Silas called after her, rising to follow with the vigilance of a parent who had learned the hard way that protection required presence. Finley carefully tucked his notebook back into his backpack before joining them at the ocean's edge. The water was cold despite the summer sun, the Pacific never truly warming even in the height of the season. Phoebe shrieked with delight as small waves crashed around her legs, her face tilted up to the clear blue sky with uninhibited joy. Watching her, Finley felt an answering lightness in his own chest. Not the absence of memory or the denial of pain, but the presence of something stronger, something like hope, something like freedom. He stepped further into the water, letting the waves wash around him, carrying away grains of sand and bringing new ones to shore in an endless cycle of renewal. The ocean stretched before him, vast and unknowable and full of possibility. Behind him, the land rose solid and certain, a foundation from which to venture forth. And beside him, his family stood within arm's reach, changed by what they had endured, but present, connected, healing. It was enough. It was everything. Finley lifted his face to the sun and allowed himself, fully and without reservation, to simply be a child on a beach in summer, not defined by trauma or responsibility or fear, but by the salt spray on his skin, the sand between his toes, and the sound of his sister's laughter carrying on the wind like a promise kept.